Step into the boundless expanse of human consciousness and the marvel of imagination. Journey deep into the captivating world of Neville Goddard's timeless masterpiece, The Law and the Promise. Picture a reality where boundaries dissolve into mere mirages, where thoughts sculpt existence and dreams materialize effortlessly. Within this text, let the brilliance of Neville Goddard's intellect lead you through the realms of mental prowess and conscious creation. From the shadows of history to the gleams of tomorrow, The Law and the Promise invites you on an odyssey through the enigmatic depths of the human psyche and its boundless potential to shape reality. Join Neville as he unveils the mysteries of the law and unveils the latent promises nestled within our consciousness. Through captivating narratives, illuminating anecdotes, and timeless insights, discover the art of transforming existence and crafting your destiny. Prepare to embark on a journey into a domain of infinite possibilities, where each utterance weaves spells, every thought births creation, and each moment holds the key to manifesting your grandest aspirations. Close your eyes, open your mind, and allow the profound wisdom of Neville Goddard to shepherd you through an extraordinary voyage towards unlocking your innate greatness. Welcome to the transformative voyage of The Law and the Promise by Neville Goddard. Chapter 1. The Law of Imagination Creates Reality. Man is all imagination. God is man and exists in use, and we in him. Man's eternal body is the imagination, that is God, himself, Blake. The purpose of the first part of this book is to show through true stories how imagination creates reality. Science advances by tentative hypothesis, then tested and accepted or rejected according to the facts of experience. The assertion that imagination creates reality needs no more consideration than science allows. It proves itself in its performance. The world in which we live is a world of imagination. Indeed, life itself is an activity of imagination, writes Professor Morrison of the University of St. Andrews. The world comes from a divine activity, identical with what we know as the activity of imagination, given to us to open man's immortal eyes inward into the worlds of thought to eternity, ever expanding into the bosom of God. Human imagination does not appear or remain in existence by its own power. Events occur because relatively stable imaginative activities have created them and continue to exist as long as they receive such support. The secret of imagination, writes Douglas Fawcett, is the greatest of all problems that the mystic aspires to solve. The supreme power, supreme wisdom, supreme delight reside in the far resolution of this mystery. When man solves the mystery of imagination, he will have discovered the secret of causation, and thus imagination creates reality. Therefore, man aware of what he imagines knows what he creates. He increasingly realizes that the drama of life is imaginary, not physical. All activity is fundamentally imaginary. An awakened imagination works toward an end, creates and preserves what is desirable, and transforms or destroys what is undesirable. Divine imagination and human imagination are not two different powers but one. The valid distinction between them lies not in the substance with which they operate, but in the degree of intensity of the operating power within oneself. Acting at high tension, an imaginal act is an immediate objective fact. At low tension, an imaginal act is realized in a temporal process. But whether imagination is at high or low tension, it is the ultimate reality and essentially non-objective reality, whose objects are poured forth like sudden whims, writes Hermann Kaiserling, Count. No object is independent of imagination at one or several levels. Everything in the world owes its character to imagination at one of its various levels. Objective reality, writes Fichte, is produced only by imagination. Objects seem so independent of our perception of them that we tend to forget they owe their origin to imagination. The world in which we live is a world of imagination, and man, through his imaginative activities, creates the realities and circumstances of life. He does so consciously or unconsciously. Men pay too little attention to this invaluable gift of human imagination, a gift that practically does not exist unless possessed consciously and a disposition to use it. All men possess the power to create reality, but this power lies dormant as if dead when not consciously exercised. Men live at the very heart of creation, human imagination, yet are no wiser for what goes on therein. The future will fundamentally not be different from man's imaginative activities. Therefore, the individual who can summon at will any imaginative activity he desires, and for whom the visions of his imagination are as real as the forms of nature, is the master of his destiny. The future is man's imaginative activity in his creative march. Imagination is the creative power not only of the poet, the artist, the actor, and the orator, but also of the scientist, the inventor, the merchant, and the artisan. Its abuse in indiscriminate creation of unattractive images is evident, but its abuse in excessive repression breeds sterility, depriving man of the true richness of experience. Imagining new solutions to increasingly complex problems is nobler than fleeing from problems. Life is the continuous solution of a continuously synthetic problem. Imagination creates events. The world created from men's imagination is formed of countless conflicting beliefs. Therefore, there can never be a perfectly stable or static state. Today's events are meant to disrupt the established order of yesterday. Imaginative men and women invariably disturb a pre-existing mental peace. Do not bow to the dictates of facts and accept life according to the external world. Affirm the supremacy of your imaginative acts over facts and subject all things to them. Hold fast to your ideal in your imagination. Nothing can take it away from you until there is first an imaginal change. Anything you do without an imaginal change is a futile adjustment of its surfaces. Imagining the wish fulfilled leads to union with that state, and during that union you act according to your imaginal change. This shows that an imaginal change will result in a behavioral change. However, your usual imaginal changes from one state to another are not transformations, for each of them is quickly followed by another in the opposite direction. But when a state becomes so stable that it becomes your constant state, then your habitual mentality defines your character, and that is a true transformation. How is this done? Self-abandonment. That is the secret. You must mentally give yourself to your wish fulfilled in your love for that state. And by living thus in the new state and not in the old, you cannot engage in what you dislike. So, the secret of the self-entrepreneur is amazing. Engage in the feeling that the wish is fulfilled, with the faith that this act of self-entrepreneurship emanates from the generous dreams of fancy in procession of images. Those naturally given priority are those of the senses. However, a present sensory impression is only an image, differing in no way from a memory image or a desire. What makes a present sensory impression objectively real is the individual's imagination working in it and thinking from it. If you would enter into the image of your imagination, then you would know what it is to be creatively transformative. You then realize your wish, and then you will be happy. Every image can be embodied, but unless you enter into the image yourself and think from it, they can do nothing. It is therefore absurd to expect the wish to be fulfilled simply with time. That which requires imaginative occupancy to produce its effect obviously cannot be effected without that occupancy. You cannot be in one image without experiencing the consequences of not being in another. Imagination is a spiritual sensation. It enters into the image of the wish fulfilled, then gives it sensory vividness and tones of reality by mentally acting as you would if it were a physical fact now. That is what I mean by spiritual sensation. Imagine you have a rose in your hand. Breathe, smell the roses. Well, if the rose is not there, why is its fragrance in the air? Through spiritual sensation, that is, through imaginative sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, you can give the image sensory vividness. If you do so, all will conspire to aid you to realize it, and upon reflecting, you will see how subtle were the threads that led you to your goal. You could never have imagined the means by which your imaginative activity used to realize itself. If you desire to escape from your present sensory fixation and transform your present life into a dream of what it could be, you need only imagine that you are already what you desire to be and feel in the manner you would hope to feel in such circumstances. Just as the make-believe play of a child recreates the world as he wishes, create your world from pure dreams of fancy. Mentally enter into your dream mentally do what you would actually do if it were true physically, you will find that dreams are realized not by the wealthy, but by the imaginative. Nothing hinders the realization of your dreams except facts, and facts are creations of imagination. If you change your imagination, you change the facts. Man and his past are a continuous structure. This structure contains all the facts that have been preserved and still operate below the threshold of his superficial mind. To him it is simply history. To him it seems unchangeable, a dead and solidly fixed past. But to himself, it is alive. It is an integral part of the living era. He cannot leave behind the errors of the past because nothing disappears. Everything that has been still exists. The past continues to exist and to give, and continues to give its results. Man must go back in memory, seek and destroy the causes of evil, no matter how far removed they are. This revisiting of the past and the representation of a scene from the past in imagination as it should have been represented the first time, I call revision, and revision leads to reversal. Changing your life means changing the past. The causes of all present evil are the unrevised scenes of the past. The past and the present make up the whole structure of man. They bear all its content. Any alteration of the content will result in an alteration in the present and the future. Live nobly so that the mind may store a past worthy of recall. If you do not, remember that the first act of correction or healing is always revision. If the past is recreated in the present, so the revised past will be recreated in the present. Otherwise, the affirmation, "Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow," Isaiah 1:18, is a lie, and it is not a lie. The purpose of this subsequent historical commentary is to link briefly but never disjointedly the distinct yet interconnected themes of the 14 chapters into which I have divided the first part of this book. I hope this will serve as a coherent guiding thread that connects everything in proof of its assertion. Imagination creates reality. Making such an assertion is easy. Proving it through the experience of others is much more difficult. Inspiring to use the law constructively in one's own life, that is the aim of this book. Chapter 2. Dwelling in Him. My God, I heard today that no one builds a majestic dwelling unless they intend to dwell in it. What house has been more majestic or can be than the human being, for whom all things are decomposing? George Herbert would wish this were true for man's noble dreams, but unfortunately, perpetual construction and deferred occupation are man's common fault. Why build a majestic dwelling if you do not intend to dwell in it? Why build a dream house and not live in it? That is the secret of those who lie awake in bed, dreaming of true things. They know how to live in their dream until it actually comes true. Man, through controlled and wakeful dreaming, can predestine his future. This imaginative activity of living in the feeling of the wish fulfilled leads man across a bridge of incidents to the realization of the dream. If we live in the dream, think and act from it and not in it, then the creative power of imagination will respond to our imaginative fantasy, and the wish fulfilled will surprise us. Man is pure imagination, so man must be where he is in imagination. Understanding that imagination is not bound by the senses or confined within the spatial limits of the body is fundamental. Even if man moves in space through the movement of his physical body, he does not need to be so restricted. He can move by changing what he is conscious of. No matter how real the scene upon which his eyes fall, man can contemplate one that has never existed before. He can always remove the mountain if it disrupts his concept of how life should be. This ability to mentally move from things as they are to what they should be is one of the most significant discoveries man can make. It reveals him as a center of imagination with intervention powers that enable him to alter the course of observed events, progressing from success to success through a series of mental transformations of nature, others, and himself. For many years, a doctor and his wife dreamed of their majestic dwelling, but it was only when they lived it imaginatively that they manifested it. Here is their story. About 15 years ago, Mrs. M and I purchased land on which we built a 2-story building housing our practice and living space. We left enough space on the land for an apartment building if our finances allowed. During all those years, we were busy paying off our mortgage. and at the end of that period, we had no money for the additional building we so desired. It is true that we had a substantial savings account, which meant security for our business, but using some of it for a new building would jeopardize that security. But his teaching awakened us to a new concept, boldly telling us that we could have what we most desired through controlled use of our imagination, and that making a wish more convincing was without money. We decided to put it to the test and forget about money, focusing on the thing we desired most in the world, the new apartment building. With this principle in mind, we mentally constructed the new building as we wished, even drawing physical plans to better formulate our mental image of the finished structure, not forgetting to think from the end, in our case, the completed and occupied building. We made many imaginary trips through our apartment building, renting units to imaginary tenants, examining each room in detail and feeling pride as friends congratulated us on our unique planning. We included in our imaginary scene a particular friend, whom I will call Mrs. X, a lady we had not seen for some time, as she had socially abandoned us, thinking we were a bit peculiar in our new way of thinking. In our imaginary scene, we escorted her through the building and asked her what she thought of it. We clearly heard her voice and had her reply, "Doctor, I find it beautiful." One day, as we were talking about our building, my wife mentioned a contractor who had built several apartment buildings in our neighborhood. We only knew him by the name on the signs next to the buildings under construction, but realizing that if we lived at the end, we wouldn't be looking for a contractor, we quickly forgot about that angle. Continuing with these daily periods of imagination for several weeks, we both felt that we were now merged with our desire and had successfully lived at the end. One day, a stranger walked into our office and identified himself as the contractor whose name had been mentioned by my wife weeks earlier. Apologetically, he said, "I don't know why I came here. I usually don't go to see people, but people come to see me." He explained that he often passed by our office and wondered why there was no apartment building on the corner lot. We assured him that we would love to have such a building there, but that we had no money for the project, not even the few $100s it would cost for plans. Our negative response did not faze him and apparently prompted him to begin devising means and ways to get the job done without us even asking. Quickly forgetting the incident, we were quite surprised when a few days later, this man called us to inform us that the plans were ready and the proposed building would cost us $100,000. We politely thanked him and did absolutely nothing. We knew that we had lived imaginatively at the end of a completed and rented building, and in our imagination, we had invested not a penny in its construction. Logical thinkers would have deemed such a negative response from potential clients as putting an end to the matter definitively. On the contrary, 2 days later, the contractor called back with the news that he had found a financial firm willing to cover the necessary loan, except for a few $1,000s. It sounds incredible, but we still did nothing, for remember, to us this building was finished and rented, and in our imagination we had invested not a penny in its construction. The rest of this story reads like a sequel to Alice in Wonderland, as the contractor came to our office the next day and said, as if he were doing us a favor, "Anyway, you'll have this new building. I've decided to finance the balance of the loan myself. If that suits you, I'll have my lawyer draw up the documents and you can pay me back with the net profits from the rents." This time we acted, we signed the documents, and construction began immediately. Most of the apartment units were rented before completion, and all but one were occupied on the day of completion. We were so excited by the seemingly miraculous events of the past few months that we did not immediately realize this apparent flaw in our mental image. But knowing what we had already accomplished through the power of imagination, we immediately conceived another imaginative scene. This time, instead of showing the person through the unit and listening to words, we put ourselves there in imagination. We visited the tenants who had already settled into that apartment. We allowed them to show us the rooms and listened to their satisfied comments. 3 days later, that apartment was rented. Our original imaginary drama had objectified in every detail except one, and that one became reality. A month later, our friend, Mrs. X, surprised us with a long-awaited visit, expressing her desire to see our new building. We joyfully took her on a tour, and at the end of the visit we heard the same words as before, emphatically spoken by our friend. "Doctor, I find it beautiful." Our 15-year dream had come true, and we now know that it could have happened at any time during those 15 years if we had known the secret of imagination and how to live at the end of desire. But now, our grand singular desire had objectified, and we had not invested a single penny of our own money. Through controlled and wakeful dreaming, the doctor and his wife created reality. They learned to live in their dream house, as if they were truly there. Although help seemed to come from outside, the course of events was ultimately determined by the imaginative activity of the doctor and his wife. Participants were drawn to their imaginary drama because it was dramatically necessary for it to be so. Their imaginative structure demanded it. All of this according to a divine law, in the existence of others mingling. Percy Bysshe Shelley's philosophy of love. The next story illustrates how a woman prepared her majestic dwelling by imaginatively sleeping in it or dwelling in it. A few months ago, my husband decided to put our house on the market. The main reason for moving, which we had discussed many times, was to find a house large enough for both of us, my mother, my aunt, plus 10 cats, 3 dogs, and a parrot. Believe it or not, the proposed move was my husband's idea, as he liked my mother and aunt very much and said I was at their house most of the time anyway. So, why not all live together and pay one tax? I liked the idea very much, but I knew that this new house would have to be something very special in size, location, and layout, as he insisted on privacy for everyone. So at that time, I was not sure whether to sell our current house or not, but I did not argue, because I knew very well from past experience with imagination that our house would never sell as long as I continued to sleep in it. 2 months and 4 or 5 real estate agents later, my husband had given up selling our house and also the agents. At this point, he had convinced me that he now wanted the change. So, for 4 nights, in my imagination, I went to sleep in the house I would like to own. On the 5th day, my husband had an appointment with a friend, and while he was there, he met a stranger who was looking for a house in the hills. He was, of course, quickly brought back to see our house. He went through it once and said, "I'll buy it." This didn't make us very popular with the agents, but that suited me perfectly, as I was happy to keep the broker's commission in the family. We moved in 10 days and stayed with my mother while we looked for our new house. We listed our requirements with every agent on Sunset Strip, as I didn't want to leave the area, and each one, without exception, told us we were crazy. They said it was completely impossible to find an old English-style house with 2 separate lounges, separate apartments, a library, and built on a flat hill with enough land to fence for large dogs and located in a specific area. When we told them the price we were willing to pay for this house, they just looked sad. I said that wasn't all we wanted. We wanted wooden cladding on the whole house, a large fireplace, a magnificent view, and isolation without close neighbors, please. At this point, the agent burst out laughing and reminded me that such a house did not exist, but if there were one, it would cost 5 times what we were willing to pay. But I knew such a house existed because my imagination had slept in it, and if I follow my imagination, then I had slept in it. In the 2nd week, we had exhausted 5 real estate agencies, and the man in the 6th office seemed a bit taken aback when one of his associates, who had not yet spoken, said, "Why don't you show them the place on King's Road?" A 3rd associate in the office chuckled bitterly and said, "That property isn't even listed, and besides, the old lady wouldn't sell you the property. She has 2 acres up there, and you know she wouldn't divide it." Well, I didn't know she wouldn't divide it, but my interest had been piqued by the street name because I particularly liked that area more than any other. So I asked why not take a look anyway, just for fun. Driving down the street, we saw an English-style brick house surrounded by tall trees and standing alone and secluded on its own hill overlooking the town from every one of its many windows. I felt a particular emotion as I walked towards the front door and was greeted by a charming woman. I don't think I breathed for the next minute or two as I stepped into the most exquisite room I had ever seen. The massive stone and brick walls of a large fireplace rose to a height of 28 feet, ending in a vaulted ceiling supported by huge redwood beams. The room seemed straight out of Dickens, and I could almost hear the carolers singing on the balcony of the upstairs lounge, overlooking the living room. A large cathedral-shaped window offered a view of the sky, mountains, and the town below, and the magnificent old redwood walls gleamed in the sunlight. We were shown a large ground-floor apartment with an adjoining library, a separate entrance, and a separate patio. 2 staircases led up to a long hallway that opened onto 2 bedrooms and separate bathrooms, and at the end of the hallway there was another living room that opened onto a second patio shaded by trees and a redwood fence. Built on 2 acres of beautiful gardens, I began to understand what the agent meant by not dividing it, as we did not want 2 acres of highly taxable property, plus a pool a block away from the house. Before leaving, I walked through that beautiful living room once more, climbed the stairs to the dining room balcony, turned around and looking down, saw my husband standing by the fireplace with a pipe in hand and a perfect expression of contentment on his face. I laid my hands on the balcony railing and watched him for a moment. When we returned to the real estate office, the 3 agents were ready to close for the day, but my husband held him back, saying, "Anyway, let's make an offer. Maybe she'll divide the property. What have we got to lose?" One agent left the office without saying a word. Another said the idea was ridiculous. The agent we had initially spoken to said, "Let's forget about it. It's an impossible dream." My husband is not easily dissuaded, but when he decides something, there is no creature more stubborn on earth. Now he was upset. He sat down, slammed his hand on the desk and roared, "It's not your job to present offers, is it?" They agreed that it was, and finally, they promised to present our offer for the property. We left, and that evening, in my imagination, I stood on the dining room balcony and watched my husband stand by the fireplace. He looked at me and said, "Well, darling, do you like our new home?" I said, "I love it." I continued to look at this beautiful room and my husband inside, and I felt the balcony railing tight in my hands until I fell asleep. The next day, as we were dining at my mother's, the phone rang, and the agent, in an incredulous voice, informed me that we had just bought a house. The owner had divided the property in 2, giving us the house and the land for the price we had offered. Man must choose between following the path of imagination or that of the senses. Compromise or neutrality is not possible. He who is not with me is against me. Matthew 12:30. When man finally identifies with his imagination rather than his senses, he finally discovers the heart of reality. So-called realists have often warned me that man will never realize his dream by simply imagining it is already there. However, man can realize his dream simply by imagining it is already there. That is exactly what this collection of stories demonstrates. If only men were willing to live imaginatively, in the feeling of the fulfilled desire, confidently advancing in their controlled waking dream, then the power of imagination would respond to their adventurous fancy, and the fulfilled desire would emerge in their lives and surprise them. Nothing is more wonderfully continuous than the things that happen every day to the man whose imagination is awake enough to be aware of them. Observe your imaginative activities, imagine the best of the best you know, and create a better world for yourself and others. Live as if the desire were already fulfilled, even if it hasn't happened yet, and it will shorten the waiting period. The world is imaginative, not mechanical. Imaginative acts, not blind fate, determine the course of history. Chapter 3. Roll back the great wheel. Oh, let your mighty imagination roll back the great wheel, until Troy burns no more. John Collins Squire, all lives are nothing but the continuous resolution of a continuous and synthetic problem. Herbert George Wells, the perfectly stable or static state is always inaccessible. The goal reached always achieves more than what the individual initially had in mind. This, in turn, creates a new situation of internal conflict, requiring innovative solutions to push man on the path of creative evolution. Its touch is infinite and offers a horizon to all aims. George Meredith, Hymn to Color. Today's events are destined to disrupt yesterday's established order. Creatively active imagination invariably disturbs pre-existing mental peace. One may wonder how, by representing others as better than they actually were, or mentally rewriting a letter to match our desire, or revising the scene of an accident, the interview with the employer, and so on, One can change what seems to be immutable facts of the past. But remember my assertions about imagination. Imagining creates reality. What has been created can be undone. Not only is it conservative, building a life from images provided by memory, but it is also transformative and creative, modifying an already existing subject. The parable of the dishonest manager, Luke 16:1-8, provides the answer to this question. We can alter our world through a certain imaginative practice, by mentally falsifying the facts, that is, intentionally modifying in imagination what we have experienced. All of this is done within the imagination itself. It's a kind of falsehood that not only is not condemned, but is actually approved in the teaching of the gospel. Through this falsehood, a man destroys the causes of evil, gains friends, and demonstrates through this revision that he is trustworthy. Because imagination creates reality, we can push revision to the extreme and change a scene that would otherwise be unforgivable. We should relive each day as we would have liked to live it, revising scenes to match our ideals. For example, suppose a disappointing news arrives by mail today. Revise the letter mentally and adjust it to the news you would have liked to receive. Then, in your imagination, reread the revised letter over and over. This will awaken the feeling of naturalness, and the imaginary acts will become facts, as soon as we feel natural in the act. That's the essence of revision, and revision leads to repeal. That's exactly what I did at the end of July. I wrote to a real estate agent about my desire to sell a piece of land that was a financial burden for me. His negative response listed all the reasons why sales were stagnant in that area and predicted a bleak waiting period until after the first year. I received his letter on a Tuesday, and in my imagination, I rewrote it to indicate that people were eager to take my listing. I read that revised letter over and over, and I extended my imaginary drama using your theme of the 4 powers of our imagination: the producer, the author, the director, and the actor from your book, Seed Time and Harvest. In my imaginary scene as a producer, I suggested the theme, "The land sells with profit." As an author, I wrote this simple scene that, to me, implied fulfillment. Standing in the real estate office, I reached out to the agent and said, "Thank you, sir." And he replied, "It was a pleasure doing business with you." As a director, I rehearsed myself as an actor until this scene became vividly real, and I felt the relief that would be mine if the burden were truly lifted. 3 days later, the agent I had originally written to called to say he had a deposit for my land at the price I had specified. I signed the papers in his office the next day, reached out and said, "Thank you, sir." And the agent replied, "It was a pleasure doing business with you." 3 days after building and acting in an imaginary scene, it became a physical reality and was played out word for word as I had heard it in my imagination. The feeling of relief and joy came not so much from the sale of the property as from the irrefutable proof that my imaginary drama had worked. If all one had accomplished was everything, what good would it be? But I discovered a power within myself that can consciously create circumstances by falsifying the facts of life. Man moves from passive reaction to active creation. This breaks the wheel of repetition and builds an ever-expanding future. If man does not always create in the fullest sense of the term, it is because he is not true to his vision, or because he thinks from what he wants, instead of thinking from his fulfilled desire. Man is an extraordinary synthesis, partly limited by his senses and partly free to dream. Therefore, his internal conflicts are perpetual. The state of conflict in the individual manifests in society. Life is a romantic adventure, living creatively, imagining innovative solutions to increasingly complex problems is far nobler than repressing or eliminating desire. Everything one wishes can be imagined to achieve it. You would be dreaming yet not asleep. John Bunyan. The Pilgrim's Progress tries to revisit your day every night before you go to bed. Try to visualize clearly and enter the revised scene that would be the imaginary solution to your problem. The revised imaginary structure can have a great influence on others, but that should not concern you. The other person influenced in the following story is deeply grateful for this influence. I wrote it last August. While on an arranged date, I met the man I wanted to marry. Sometimes it happens, and it happened to me. He was everything I had ever imagined desirable in a husband. 2 days after that lovely evening, I had to move because of my job, and that same week the mutual friend who introduced me to him moved out of town. I realized that the man I had met probably didn't know my new address, and I wasn't really sure he even knew my name. After your last conference, I talked to you about this situation. Although I had many other dates, I couldn't forget this man. Your teaching focused on revising our day, and after talking to you, I decided to revise my day every night before going to bed. That night I felt I was in a different bed at home, like a married woman, and not like a young single girl sharing an apartment with 3 other girls. I turned an imaginary wedding ring on my imaginary left hand, telling myself over and over again, "This is wonderful. I am really Mrs. J.E." And I fell asleep in what was a waking dream just a moment before. I repeated this imaginary scene every night for a month. The first week of October, he found me for our second date, and I knew my dreams were in the right place. Your teaching tells us to live in the feeling of our fulfilled desire until that desire becomes a fact. While I didn't know how he felt about me, I continued night after night to live in the feeling of my fulfilled dream. The results in November. He asked me to marry him. In January, we announced our engagement, and the following May, we got married. The most charming part of all this, however, is that I am happier than I ever dared to imagine possible, and I know in my heart that he is too. Mrs. J.E. By using her imagination radically rather than conservatively, by building her world from purely imaginary dreams instead of using images provided by memory, she realized her dream. Common sense would have used images provided by her memory, and in this manner she would have perpetuated the fact of lack in her life. Imagination created what she desired from an imaginary dream. Everyone must live fully on the level of imagination, and this must be undertaken consciously and deliberately. Lovers and madmen have such. Seething brains, such fantasies that apprehend more than cold reason fully comprehends. William Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. If our time of revision is well used, we need not worry about results. Our deepest desires will be realized. You are real earth, I am myself in the dream of who exists. Frank Kendon, The Awakening of Time. There is no inevitable permanence in anything. Both past and present continue to exist only because they are sustained by imagination to some extent, and a radical transformation of life is always possible if man revises the undesirable part of it. In his letter, Mr. R.S. questions this theme of influence. During your current series of lectures, problems with collections arose in one of my trusts. The property, a house with land, was neglected and in poor condition. The owners seemingly spent their money in bars, while their 2 young daughters, aged 9 and 11, were remarkably neglected. However, disregarding appearances, I began to revise the situation in my imagination. I drove my wife past the property and said to her, "Isn't it beautiful? The garden is so neat and well kept. These people really show their love for their home. It's a trust we'll never have to worry about." I saw the house and the land as I wanted to see them, as such a delightful place that filled me with pleasure every time I thought of that property. I repeated my imaginary scene after practicing this revision for some time. The woman living in the house had a car accident. During her hospital stay, her husband disappeared. The daughters were taken care of by neighbors, and I was tempted to visit the mother in the hospital to assure her she was getting help if needed. But how could I do that when my imaginary scene involved her and her family being happy, prosperous, and clearly satisfied? So I did nothing more than my daily revision. Shortly after she was discharged from the hospital, the woman and her 2 daughters also disappeared. Payments for the property were sent, and a few months later she reappeared with a marriage certificate and a new husband. At this point, all payments are up to date. The 2 daughters are clearly happy and well cared for, and the owners have added a room to the property, providing additional security for our trust. It was wonderful to resolve my problem without threats, without harsh words, without eviction or concerns for the girls. But there was something in my imagination that sent this woman to the hospital. Mr. R.S., any imaginative activity that gains intensity through our focused attention on the clarity of the desired end tends to spill over into regions beyond where we are. But we must let such imaginative activity fend for itself. It is wonderfully ingenious at adapting and adjusting means to realize itself. Once we think in terms of influence rather than clarity of the desired end, the effort of imagination becomes. An effort of the will, and the great art of imagination is perverted into tyranny. The buried past generally rests deeper than our superficial mind can fathom. But fortunately for this woman, she remembered and demonstrated that the past made can also be unmade through revision. For 39 years, I suffered from back pain. The pain would wax and wane, but never completely vanish. The condition had progressed to the point where I was receiving almost constant medical treatment. The doctor would relocate my hip at that time, but the pain simply would not go away. One night, I heard you speak about revision and wondered if a condition of nearly 40 years could be revised. I remembered that at the age of 3 or 4, I fell backward from a very high swing and was very sick at the time due to a serious hip injury. Since then, I had never been completely free from pain and had spent a great deal of money trying to relieve the condition unsuccessfully. This year, in August, the pain became more intense, and one night I decided to test myself and try to revise that old accident that had been the cause of so much pain and costly medical expenses for most of my adult life. Many nights passed before I could feel myself back in childhood playing again, but I succeeded. One night, I truly felt on that swing, feeling the gust of wind as the swing rose higher and higher. As the swing slowed down, I leaped forward, landing solidly and easily on my feet. In the imaginary action, I ran to my mother and insisted she come see what I could do. I did it again, jumping off the swing and landing safely on my 2 feet. I repeated this imaginary act again and again until I fell asleep doing it. In 2 days, the pain in my back and hip began to relent, and in 2 months, the pain ceased to exist for me. A condition that had tormented me for over 39 years, that had cost a small fortune in healing attempts, no longer existed. To the scissors of revision, we owe our chief fruit. Man and his past are a continuous structure. This structure contains all the past that has been preserved and continues to operate below the threshold of his senses to influence the present and future of his life. It carries with it all its content. Any alteration of the content will result in an alteration of the present and future. The first act of correction or healing is always to revise. If the past can be recreated in the present, it can also be revised. Thus, the revised past appears at the very heart of his present life. It is not fate, but a revised past that has brought about good fortune. Make results and achievements the crucial proof of true imagination, and your confidence in the power of imagination to create reality will gradually grow from your experiences with revision. Faced with experience, it is only through this process that you can realize the potent potential of your awakened and controlled imagination. "How much do you owe to my lord?" He answered, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, "Take your bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. Luke 16, 5-6. This parable of the dishonest manager encourages us to mentally falsify the facts of life, to alter an already ongoing theme. Through such imaginative lies, a man gains friends. Luke 16:9. Every day, at nightfall, mentally revise the events of life and make them correspond to events worthy of being recalled. Tomorrow take the altered pattern and advance it until it finally comes true in the heights of success. The reader will find it worthwhile to follow these tracks of imaginative scene construction involving the accomplished desire and mentally participate in these scenes until they become reality. We are dealing here with the secret of imagination, in which man sees himself awakening in a world entirely subject to his imaginative power. Man can understand the recurrence of events quite well. Building a world from images provided by memory keeps things as they are. It gives him a sense of security in the stability of things. However, the presence within him of a power that awakens and becomes what he wants, radically changing his form, his environment, and the circumstances of life, inspires in him a sense of insecurity. a terrible fear of the future. Now it is too late to awaken from sleep, Romans 13:11, and put an end to all the unpleasant creations of the sleeping man. Revise every day. Let your powerful imagination turn the great wheel back until Troy does not burn. Sir John Collins, Night of the Birds. Chapter 4. There is no fiction. The distinction between what is real and what is imaginary is not a distinction that can be maintained definitively. All existing things are, in an intelligible sense, imaginary. John Mackenzie. There is no fiction. If imaginative activity can produce a physical effect, our physical world must be essentially imaginary. To demonstrate this, we need only observe our imaginative activities and see if they produce corresponding external effects. If so, then we must conclude that there is no fiction. Today's imaginary drama becomes tomorrow's fact. If we had a broader view of causality, if we understood that causality is mental and not physical, that our mental states cause physical effects, then we would understand our responsibility as creators and would imagine only the best and the imaginable. The fable represented as a kind of play in the mind is what causes the physical facts of life. Man believes that reality lies in the solid objects he sees around him, that it is in this world that the drama of life begins, that events suddenly arise out of nowhere, created moment by moment from previous physical facts. But causality does not reside in the external world of facts. The drama of life originates in man's imagination. The true act of becoming occurs within man's imagination and not outside. The following stories could define causality as the gathering of mental states which, occurring, create what the gathering implies. The prologue to Walter Lord's A Night to Remember illustrates my statement. Imagination creates reality. In 1898, a struggling author named Morgan Robertson invented a novel about a fabulous ocean liner much larger than anything ever built before. Robertson loaded his ship with rich and complacent people, then sank it on a cold April night against an iceberg. Somehow, this illustrated the futility of everything, and indeed the book was called Futility when it appeared that year, published by the firm M.F. Mansfield. 14 years later, a British shipping company called White Star Line built a very similar ship to the one in Robertson's novel. The new liner had a displacement of 66,000 tons. Robertson's had 70,000. The real ship was 883 feet long. The fictional ship was 800 feet. Both could carry about 3,000 people and had enough lifeboats for only a fraction of that number. But that didn't matter, as both were considered unsinkable. On April 19, 1912, the real ship left Southampton on its maiden voyage to New York. Its cargo included an irreplaceable copy of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat and a passenger list worth a collective $250 million. On its return, it also struck an iceberg and sank on a cold April night. Robertson had called his ship the Titan. The White Star Line had called its ship the Titanic. If Morgan Robertson had known that imagination creates reality, that today's fiction is tomorrow's fact, he would have written the novel Futility at the time of the disaster. Tragedy, writes Schopenhauer, clarifies more than ever the conviction that life is a bad dream from which we must awaken, and the bad dream is caused by the imaginative activity of sleeping humanity. Imaginal activities can be distant from their manifestation, and unobserved events are mere appearances. Causality, as seen in this tragedy, is elsewhere in space-time, far from the scene of action, invisible to all. Robertson's imaginative activity was like a scientist in a control room, guiding his guided missile through space-time. He who paints a picture writes a work or a book that others read while he sleeps in his bed. On the other side of the world, when they turn this page, the sleeper might as well be dead. What does he know of his distant, unfelt life? What does he know of the thoughts his thoughts provoke, the life his life gives, or the fight about it? Some meditate, some praise still. Who is more alive, the one who sleeps, or his vivid mind elsewhere, or a dozen other places that keep the attention focused and ward off sleep from others? What is he who sleeps, or he who cannot feel or see his own mind? Samuel Butler. Imaginative writers do not communicate their worldview, but their attitudes, which result in their vision. Shortly before her death, Catherine Mansfield said to her friend Arash, "In life there are as many aspects as there are attitudes towards it, and the aspects change with the attitudes. If we could change our attitude, we would not only see life differently, but life itself would be different. Life would undergo a change in its appearance because we ourselves would have undergone a change in our attitude. Perceiving a new pattern is what I call a creative attitude towards life. The prophets," writes Blake in the modern sense of the term, "never existed. Jonah was not a prophet in the modern sense, for his prophecy about Nineveh failed. Every honest man is a prophet. He pronounces his opinion on private and public affairs. So if you continue in this manner, the result is this. He never says that such a thing will happen no matter what you do. A prophet is a seer, not an arbitrary dictator. The prophet's function is not to tell us what is inevitable, but to tell us what can be built from persistent imaginative activities. The future is determined by humanity's imaginative activities, activities in their creative march, activities you can see in your dreams and visions in your head as you lie in your bed." Daniel 2:28. Would that all the Lord's people were prophets? Numbers 11:29, in the true sense of the term. Like that dancer who, from the summit of his realized ideal, sees even higher peaks to climb. After reading this story, you will understand why he is so sure he can predetermine any materialistic future he desires, and why he is also sure that others give reality to what would otherwise be just a product of his imagination. Nothing exists outside of imagination at one level or another. Nothing continues to exist except what imagination sustains. The mind can create substance and populate its own planets with beings brighter than they have ever been, and bring to life forms that can outlast any flesh, Lord Byron. As my story begins at the age of 19, I was a moderately successful dance teacher and remained in that static state for nearly 5 years. At the end of this period, I met a young woman who convinced me to attend her lectures. Listening to you say that imagination creates reality, I thought the whole idea was ridiculous. However, I decided to accept your challenge and refute your thesis. I bought your book Out of This World and read it several times, still unconvinced. I then set a rather ambitious goal. My current position was that of an instructor at the Arthur Murray Dance Studio, and my goal was to own a franchise and be the manager of my own Arthur Murray studio. This seemed like the most improbable thing in the world, as franchises were extremely difficult to obtain. Moreover, I did not have the funds to start such an operation. However, I adopted the feeling of my accomplished desire, for night after night, in my imagination, I fell asleep managing my own studio. 3 weeks after the first night of my imaginal drama, it materialized almost word for word. My partner accepted the new studio in Bakersfield, and I had the Reno studio to myself. I was now convinced of the truth of your teaching, and I will never forget it. Now, I wanted to share this wonderful knowledge, the imaginal power, with my staff. I tried to tell them of the wonders they could accomplish, but I could not convince many. However, a fantastic incident occurred from my efforts to tell this story. A young teacher told me he believed in my story, but said it probably would have happened anyway over time. He insisted the whole theory was unfounded, but he claimed that if I could tell him something incredible that would really happen, and he could observe it, then he would believe. I accepted his challenge and devised truly fantastic proof. The Reno studio is the most insignificant in the entire Murray system due to the small population in the city itself. There are over 300 Murray studios in the country, with much larger populations, providing better chances of attracting students. So, my proof was this. I told the teacher that within the next 3 months, at the time of a national dance convention, the small Reno studio would be the main topic of conversation at that convention. He calmly asserted that this was completely impossible. That night, as I retired, I found myself before a huge audience. I was speaking about creative imagination and feeling the anxiety of facing such a vast audience. But I also felt the wonderful sensation of being accepted by the audience. I heard the roar of applause, and as I left the stage I saw Mr. Murray himself approach and shake my hand. I reenacted this entire drama night after night, and it began to acquire the nuances of reality. I knew I had succeeded again, that my imaginal drama was materializing in every detail. My small Reno studio was the talk of the convention, and on that stage, just as in my imagination, but even after this incredible yet very real event, the young teacher who had challenged me was still not convinced. He said everything had happened too naturally and that anyway it would have happened. I didn't care about his attitude because his challenge had given me another chance to prove, at least to myself, that imagination truly creates reality. From that moment on, I continued to imagine owning the largest Arthur Murray dance studio in the world. Night after night, in my imagination, I saw myself accepting a studio franchise for a major city. 3 weeks later, Mr. Murray called me and offered me a studio in a city of 1.5 million people. Now my goal is to make my studio the biggest and best in the entire system, and of course I know that will happen through my imagination. Imagining is difficult to grasp, like mercury that disappears with each metamorphosis and thus shows its transformative magic. We must look beyond the physical fact to find the imagination that caused it. For a year, Junior was lost in his metamorphosis, but fortunately, he recalled the ridiculous nonsense he had gone through before getting his own studio, and he began to read the book again. Imaginary acts at the human level require some time to develop, but imaginary acts, whether recorded on paper or buried in the heart of a hermit, will come to pass over time. Try it yourself, even out of curiosity. You will discover that the prophet is your own imagination, and you will know there is no fiction. We must never be sure that it was not a woman treading the winepress that initiated that subtle change in the minds of men, or that the passion for which so many countries have taken to the sword did not begin in the mind of a shepherd, lighting up his eyes for a moment before following its course. William Butler Yeats. There is no fiction. Imagination is realized in what our lives become, and I have told you before it happens, so that when it happens you may believe. John 14. The Greeks were right. The gods came down among us in the guise of men. Hebrews 1:4. But they have fallen asleep and are unaware of the power they wield with their imaginative activities. The gods' dreams are real, and find their delight in an immortal slumber. John Keats. An authoress is fully aware that today's fiction may become tomorrow's reality. In this letter she writes, "In the spring I finished a little novel, sold it and forgot it. It was only months later that I sat down and nervously compared some facts of my fiction with some facts of my life. Please read a brief summary of my created story, then compare it with my personal experience. The protagonist of my story went on vacation to Vermont, to the small town of Stowe, Vermont, to be exact. Upon arrival, she was confronted with unpleasant behavior from her companion, which forced her to continue her life pattern of allowing another's selfish demands to dominate her, or to break this pattern and leave. She broke it and returned to New York. Upon her return, and the story continues, events shaped into a marriage proposal she joyfully accepted. From my side of this story, as the little events unfolded, I began to recall the dictates of my own pen and their significance. Here's what happened to me. I received an invitation from a friend offering me a vacation at her summer house in Vermont. I accepted and was not surprised at first to find out that her summer house was in the town of Stowe. Upon arrival, I found my hostess in such a state of nervousness that I realized I was either going to have a miserable summer or choose to leave. Never before in my life had I been strong enough to ignore what I thought were the demands of duty and friendship. But this time I did it, and returned to New York without ceremony. A few days after I got back home, I also received a marriage proposal. But at this point, reality and fiction diverged. I turned down the offer. I now know there is no such thing as fiction. The green earth is forgetful. Only the gods remember eternally. For their great memories, the gods are known. George Meredith, Ballads and Poems of Tragic Life. Endings remain true to their imaginative origins. We reap the fruit of the forgotten time of the flower. In life, events do not always spring up where we sowed the seed. Therefore, it is possible we may not recognize our own harvest. Events are the manifestation of hidden imaginative activity. Man is free to imagine what he wants. That's why, despite all the fatalists and prophets of doom, all awake men know they are free. They know they create reality. There is a biblical passage that supports this assertion, and it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Genesis 41:13. William Butler Yeats must have discovered there is no fiction, for after describing some of his experiences in the conscious use of imagination, he writes, "If all those who have described events like this have not dreamed, we should rewrite our histories, for all men, and certainly all imaginative men, must always cast spells, enchantments, illusions." Yeats. Nothing appears or continues to exist by its own power. Events occur because comparatively stable imaginative activities have created them and continue to exist due to the support they receive from these imaginative activities. The role of imagination in the conscious creation of circumstances is evident in this series of stories. You will see how telling a successful story about the conscious use of imagination can serve as a stimulus and challenge for others to attempt it and see. One night, a gentleman stood up in my audience and said he had no question to ask, but would like to tell me something. Here is his story. When he came out of the army after World War II, he found a job that paid him $5 a week. After 10 years, he was making $600 a month. At that point, he bought my book, Awakening Imagination, and read the chapter, Pruning Shears of Revision. Through daily practice of revision, as described in the book, he was able to tell my audience 2 years later that his income equaled that of the President of the United States. In my audience, there was a man who, by his own admission, was down and out. He had read the same book, but suddenly realized he had done nothing with the use of his imagination to solve his financial problem. He decided he would try to imagine himself as the winner of Pool 510 at the racetrack. In his own words, in this pool, one tries to pick the winners from the 5th to the 10th race. Here's what I did in my imagination. I stood there, ordering my tickets and feeling like I had each of the 6 winners. I played out this scene again and again in my imagination until I truly felt chills. Then I saw the cashier handing me a large sum of money, which I placed under my imaginary shirt. That was my entire imaginary scenario, and for 3 weeks, night after night, I played out this scene and fell asleep in the action. After 3 weeks, I physically went to the racetrack, and that day, every detail of my imaginative play became reality. The only change in the scene was that the cashier handed me a check for a total amount of $4,000 instead of cash. After my lecture, the night this story was told, a man in the audience asked me if I believed it was possible for him to replicate TK's experience. I told him he must decide the circumstances of his imaginary scene himself, but whatever scene he chose, he must create a drama that would feel natural to him and imagine the ending with all the feeling he could muster. He should not strive for the means to achieve the end, but live imaginatively in the feeling of the wish fulfilled. A month later, he showed me a $16,000 check he had won in another Pool 510 at the same racetrack the day before. This man had a more interesting epilogue to his duplication of TK's good fortune. His first win solved his immediate financial difficulties, though he wanted more money for his family's future security, and what was more important to him, he wanted to prove it wasn't an accident. He reasoned that if his good luck could happen a second time in a row, the so-called law of probabilities would yield to the evidence that his imaginative structures truly produced this miraculous reality. So, he dared to put his imagination to a second test. He wanted a substantial bank account, which for me meant seeing a high balance on my bank statements. So, in my imagination, I played out a scene that led me to 2 banks. In each bank, I saw an appreciative smile directed at me from the bank manager when I entered his establishment, and I heard the warm greeting from the cashier. I asked to see my account statement. In one bank, I saw a balance of $0. In the other, I saw a balance of $15,000. My imaginary scene didn't stop there. Immediately after seeing the balances of my bank accounts, I directed my attention to my horse racing system, which, through a 10-step progression, would bring my winnings to $11,133 with an initial capital of $200. I would have divided the winnings into 12 piles on my desk, counting the money in my imaginary hands. I would have put $1,000 in each of the 11 piles and the remaining $533 in the last pile. My imaginary accounting would have totaled $6,533, including my bank balances. I played out this entire imaginary scene every morning, every afternoon and every evening for less than a month. And on March 2nd, I returned to the hot racetrack. I made my tickets, but curiously, and without knowing why, I made 6 more, exactly identical to the 6 already made. But in the 10th selection, I made a mistake and copied 2 tickets twice. As the winners came in, I had 2 of each paying 16,123s. I also had 6 consolation tickets, each paying 657s. The combined total was 3,788. My imaginary accounting a month earlier was 3,533 hours. 2 very profound points of interest for me were that, by apparent accident, I had marked 2 winning tickets identically, and also that at the end of the 9th race, which was one of the major winners, the trainer had attempted to scratch the horse, but the stewards had denied the trainer's request. How subtle were the threads that led to his goal. The results must testify to our imagination, otherwise we don't truly imagine the end at all. AJF faithfully imagined the end, and all things conspired to aid in his harvest. His mistake in copying a winning ticket twice and the trainer's refusal to allow the request were events created by the imaginative drama to progress toward his goal. Chance can be defined as that element in reality of change, that is, in the fluid synthesis of events that is irreducible to law or causal category. To truly live, we must be aware of our imaginative activities, or at least of the end toward which they tend. We must ensure it's the end we desire. Wise imagination identifies only with activities that have value or promise good. Though man seems to be dealing with a material world, he actually lives in a world of imagination. When he discovers it's not the physical world of facts, but imaginative activities that shape his life, then the physical world will no longer be reality, and the world of imagination will no longer be a dream. The road goes uphill all the way, yes. Until the end, we'll make the journey from morning till night, my friend. Christina Georgina Rossetti, The Hill, Chapter 6, Visionary Fantasy. The nature of visionary fancy or imagination is very little known, and the external and permanent nature of its ever-existing images is considered less permanent than things of vegetative and generative nature. However, the oak dies just as the lettuce does, but its eternal image and individuality never die but renew through its seed. Similarly, the imaginative image returns through the seed of contemplative thought. Blake. The images of our imagination are the realities of which any physical manifestation is but a shadow. If we are faithful to the vision, the image will itself create the only physical manifestation it has the right to express. We speak of the reality of something when we refer to its material substance. That is precisely what an imagist means by its unreality or shadow. Imagining is a spiritual sensation. By entering into the feeling of your wish fulfilled through spiritual sensation, using imaginative sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, you will give your image the sensory vividness necessary to produce that image in your outer world or shadow. Here's the story of someone who remained faithful to their vision. Being a true imagist, he remembered what he had heard in his imagination. Here's how a friend who knows my passionate love for opera writes. He tried to get the recording of Tristan and Isolde by Kirsten Flagstad for me at Christmas. In over a dozen record stores, he was told the same thing. RCA Victor doesn't reissue this recording, and there have been no copies available since June. On December 27th, I decided to demonstrate your principle again by obtaining the album I intensely desired. Lying in my mental living room, I mentally entered a record store I frequent and asked the only clerk whose face and voice I could remember if they had the complete version of Flagstad's Isolde. He answered yes, we have it. That ended the scene, and I repeated it until it became real to me. Late in the afternoon, I went to that record store to physically play out the scene. No detail provided by the senses encouraged me to believe I could leave that store with those records. I had been told the same thing last September, by the same clerk in the same store that my friend had visited before Christmas. Approaching the clerk I had seen in my imagination that morning, I asked him if they had the complete version of Flagstad's Isolde. He answered, "No, we don't have it." Without saying anything audible, I internally said, "That's not what I heard you say." As I turned to leave the store, I noticed on an upper shelf what I believed to be an advertisement for that record set. I commented to the clerk that if they didn't have the product, they shouldn't. "You're right," he responded. And as he reached for it, he discovered it was a complete album with the 5 records. The scene didn't unfold exactly as I had constructed it, but the result confirmed what my imagined scenario implied. How can I thank you? After reading the letter, we must agree with Anthony Eden that a supposition, even if false, if persisted in, will become a fact. FB's fancy, merging with the sensory field of the record store, enriched some aspects of it and made them his own, what he perceived. Our future is our imagination in its creative march. FB used his imagination for conscious purposes by representing life as he wished it, and thereby affecting life rather than merely reflecting it. He was so certain that his imaginative drama was reality and that the physical act was just. A shadow that when the clerk said, "No, we don't have it," FB thought inwardly, "That's not what I heard you say." He not only remembered what he had heard, but he recalled it again. Imagining the wish fulfilled is the quest that finds the question that receives the door that opens. He saw and heard what he wanted to see and hear, and did not accept a "no, we don't have it" as an answer. The imagist daydreams. He's not the servant of his vision, but the master of the direction of his attention. Imaginative constancy controls the perception of events in space-time. Unfortunately, most men are as changeable as a joyless eye that finds no object worthy of its constancy. Percy Bysshe Shelley to the moon. Mrs. G.R. also heard in her imagination what she wanted to hear physically, and knew that the inner world had to confirm it. Here's her story. Some time ago, we put our house up for sale, which was necessary for us to buy a larger property we had put a deposit on. Several people would have bought our house immediately, but we had to explain that we couldn't conclude any deal until we knew if our offer for the property we wanted had been accepted. At that time, a broker called us and literally begged us to allow him to show our house to a client of his who was eager for that location and would be willing to pay even more than what we were asking. We explained our situation to the broker and his client. Both said they had no problem waiting for our other transaction to be concluded. The broker asked us to sign a document which, according to him, we had no obligation, but it would give him the first sales opportunity if our other transaction was concluded. We signed the document, and then we learned that, according to California real estate law, nothing could have been more binding. A few days later, our transaction for the new property fell through. So we informed that broker, and his verbal response was, "Well, just forget about it." 2 weeks later, he filed a $15,000 commission lawsuit against us. A trial date was set, and we requested a jury trial. Our lawyer assured us he would do his best, but that the law at this particular stage was so strict that there was no chance of winning the case. When the time for trial came, my husband was in the hospital and couldn't appear with me for our defense. I had no witnesses, but the broker brought 3 lawyers and several witnesses to court against us. Our lawyer told me we didn't stand a chance of winning. I turned to my imagination, and here's what I did, completely ignoring everything the lawyers, witnesses, and judge had said, which seemed to favor the plaintiff. I only thought about the words I wanted to hear in my imagination. I listened carefully, and I heard the jury foreman say, "We find the defendant not guilty." I listened until I knew it to be true. I closed the ear of my mind to everything said in that courtroom and heard only those words, "We find the defendant not guilty." The jury deliberated from lunch break until 4:30, and during those hours I sat in the courtroom and heard those words again and again in my imagination. When the jury members returned, the judge asked the foreman to rise and deliver the verdict. The foreman stood up and said, "We find the defendant not guilty. Mrs. G.R., if dreams were for sale, what would you buy?" Thomas Lovell Beddoes, Sale of Dreams. You wouldn't buy your wish fulfilled. Your dreams have no price and cost no money. By locking the jury in her imagination and only listening to what she wanted to hear, she called for a unanimous decision in her favor. By imagining as reality everything that exists, with that, the lady achieved her wish fulfilled. Hebel's assertion that the poet creates from contemplation is also true for imagists. They know how to use their video and audio hallucinations to create reality. Nothing is as fatal as conformity. We should not allow the ring of facts to encircle us. Change the image, and with it, change the fact. Rowe used the art of seeing and feeling to create her vision in imagination. A year ago, I took my children to Europe, leaving my furnished apartment in the care of my housekeeper. When we returned to the United States a few months later, I discovered that my housekeeper and all my furniture were gone. The building superintendent claimed that the housekeeper had moved my furniture at my request. I couldn't do anything at that time, so I took my children and went to a hotel. Of course, I reported the incident to the police and also hired private detectives for the case. Both organizations investigated all the moving companies and storage warehouses in the city of New York, but without success. It seemed that there was absolutely no trace of my furniture or my housekeeper. Having exhausted all external sources, I remembered your teaching and decided to try using my imagination in this matter. As I sat in my hotel room, I closed my eyes and imagined myself in my own apartment, sitting in my favorite chair and surrounded by all my personal furniture. I looked across the living room to the piano, where I kept pictures of my children. I would continue to look at my piano until the whole room became vividly real to me. I could see my children's pictures and truly feel the fabric of the chair I was sitting on in my imagination. The next day, as I stepped out of my bank, I turned to walk towards my empty apartment instead of my hotel. When I reached the corner of the street, I discovered my mistake, and I was about to turn back when my attention was drawn to a pair of very familiar ankles. Yes, the ankles belonged to my housekeeper. I approached her and took her arm. She was quite frightened, but I assured her that all I wanted from her were my furniture. I called a taxi, and she took me to where her friends had stored my furniture. In one day, my imagination had found what an entire police force of a major city and private detectives couldn't find in weeks. Rowe, that lady, knew the secret of imagining before calling the police. But imagination, despite its importance, was forgotten as attention was focused on the facts. However, what reason could not find by force, imagination found effortlessly. Nothing happens simply, including the feeling of loss, without its imaginary support. By imagining herself sitting in her own chair, in her own living room, surrounded by all her own furniture, she removed the imaginary support she had given to her feeling of loss, and by that imaginary change, she found her lost furniture and restored her home. Your imagination is most creative when you imagine things as you want them to be, constructing a new experience from a flight of fancy. To build such a flight of fancy in your imagination, FG engaged all her senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, even taste. Here's her story. Since childhood, I had dreamed of visiting distant places. The West Indies in particular ignited my fancy, and I reveled in the sensation of being there in reality. Dreams are wonderfully economical, and as an adult, I continued to dream my dreams, for I had neither money nor time to realize them. Last year I was hospitalized, requiring surgery. I had heard your teaching, and while I was recovering, I decided to intensify my favorite reverie. During my free time, I actually wrote to the Alcoa steamship line requesting free travel brochures, and I pored over them hour after hour, selecting the ship, cabin, and 7 ports I most wanted to visit. I closed my eyes, and in my imagination, I boarded the gangplank of that ship and felt the motion of the water as the great liner moved across the ocean. I heard the sound of the waves beating against the ship's sides, felt the hazy warmth of the tropical sun on my face, and smelled and tasted the salt in the air as we sailed over blue waters for an entire week. Confined to a hospital bed, I lived the free and happy experience of truly being on that ship. Then, on the eve of my release from the hospital, I put away the colorful brochures and forgot about them. 2 months later, I received a telegram from an advertising agency telling me I had won a contest. I remembered having dropped a contest coupon a few months earlier in a neighborhood supermarket, but I had completely forgotten the act. I had won the first prize and, wonder of wonders, it entitled me to a Caribbean cruise sponsored by the Alcoa steamship line. But the wonder didn't stop there. The exact cabin in which I had lived mentally and moved about while confined to a hospital bed had been assigned to me. And to make an already incredible story even more amazing, I sailed on the same ship I had chosen, which stopped not at one, but at all 7 ports I wanted to visit. Traveling is a privilege not of the rich, but of the imaginative. Stephen Berry, in Stanton Dye Essential Life, 1908, Chapter 7, States of Mind. It is an era when mood decides the fortunes of people, rather than fortune deciding the mood. Being Winston Churchill. Men consider their moods too much as effects, and not enough as causes. Moods are imaginary activities, without which no creation is possible. We say we are happy because we have achieved our goal, without realizing that the process works just as well in the opposite direction, that we will achieve our goal because we have assumed the happy feeling of the wish fulfilled. Moods are not only the result of the conditions of our life, they are also the causes of them. In The Psychology of Emotions, Professor Ribot writes, "An idea that is only an idea produces or does nothing. It acts only if it is felt, if it is accompanied by an affective state, if it arouses tendencies, that is to say, motor elements." The lady in the following story felt so strongly the feeling of her wish fulfilled that she transformed her mood into a character of the frosty night in a charming dream. Most of us read and enjoy fairy tales, but we all know that stories of unlikely riches and good fortune are for the amusement of the very young. But they are. I want to tell you something incredibly wonderful that was given to me by the power of my imagination. And I am not young in years. We live in an age that believes in neither fairy tales nor magic. And yet everything I could desire in my wildest dreams was given to me by the simple use of what you teach, that imagination creates reality, and feeling is the secret of imagination. At the time this wonderful thing happened to me, I was without work, and had no family to turn to for support. I needed almost everything to find decent employment. I needed a car to search for it, and even if I had one, it was so worn out that it was about to fall apart. I was behind on my rent. I had no suitable clothes to look for work, and today it's not fun for a 55-year-old woman to apply for any kind of job. My bank account was almost depleted, and I had no friends to turn to, but I had attended your lectures for almost a year, and my despair drove me to test my imagination. In fact, I had nothing to lose. It was natural for me, I suppose, to start by imagining possessing everything I needed. But I needed so many things, and in such a short time, that I found myself exhausted when I finally finished my list, and by then I was so nervous that I couldn't sleep. At one of your lectures, I heard about an artist who captured the feeling, or the word as you called it, of wonderful in his personal experience. I began to apply this idea to my case. Instead of thinking and imagining every item I needed, I tried to capture the feeling that something wonderful was happening to me. Not tomorrow, not next week, but right now, I repeated to myself over and over again as I fell asleep. It's wonderful. Something wonderful is happening to me right now. And as I fell asleep, I felt how I would feel in such circumstances. I repeated this imaginary action and feeling for 2 months, night after night. Then one day, early in October, I met a friend by chance whom I hadn't seen for months, and he informed me that he was about to take a trip to New York. He had lived in New York many years ago, and we talked about the city for a while, then we parted ways. I completely forgot about the incident. A month later, the next day, this man called my house and simply handed me a certified check in my name for $500. After overcoming the initial shock of seeing my name on a check for such a large amount of money, the story that unfolded seemed like a dream to me. It was a friend from my past whom I hadn't seen or heard from in over 25 years. I learned now that this friend from my past had become extremely wealthy in those 25 years. Our mutual acquaintance, who had brought the check to me, had met him by chance on his trip to New York last month. During their conversation, They talked about me, and for reasons I was not supposed to know, because until this day I have not received news from him personally, and I have never tried to contact him. This old friend decided to share some of his great wealth with me. Over the next 2 years, from his lawyer's office, I received monthly checks so generous in amount that they not only covered all the daily needs of life, but also left plenty for all the charming things of life. A car, clothes, a spacious apartment, and most importantly, no need to earn my daily bread. Last month, I received a letter and some legal documents to sign that provided for the continuation of this monthly income for the rest of my natural life. If the fool persisted in his folly, he would become wise, said William Blake. Sir Winston exhorts us to act under the assumption that we already possess what we seek, to assume a virtue if we have it not, as William Shakespeare says in Hamlet. Is not this the secret of miracles? Thus, to the paralyzed man, he was told to rise, take up his bed, and walk, to act mentally, as if he were healed, Matthew 9:1. And when the actions of his imagination corresponded to the actions he would physically perform if he were healed, he was healed. This story might be considered as bound to happen anyway, but those who read it carefully will find reasons to marvel. It begins a year ago when I left Los Angeles to visit my daughter in San Francisco. Instead of finding the joyful person I had always known, I found her in deep distress, without knowing the cause, and without a desire to inquire. I waited for her to tell me about her great financial difficulties and her need for $10,000 immediately. I am not a poor woman, but I did not have that much cash available quickly. Knowing my daughter, I knew she wouldn't accept anyway that I borrow money from her. She asked for my help in my own way, meaning by using my imagination, as I had often spoken to her about your teachings, and some of my words should have had an impact. I immediately agreed to this plan on the condition that she help me to help her. We decided on an imaginary scene that we could both practice, involving seeing money coming from all directions. We felt that money was flowing to her, from all corners, until she was in the midst of a sea of money. But we always did it with a feeling of joy for all involved, and we didn't think about the means, only about the happiness for everyone. The idea seemed to catch fire in her, and I know she was responsible for what happened. A few days later, she certainly returned to a joyful and confident state of mind, although nothing indicated that money was actually coming at that time. I returned home to the east. When I arrived home, I called my mother, a lovely young woman of 91, who immediately asked me to come see her. I wanted a day of rest, but she couldn't wait, it had to be now. Of course, I went to see her, and after greeting me, she handed me a check for $10,000 in my daughter's name. Before I could say anything, she handed me 3 additional checks totaling $5,000 for my daughter's children. She explained that, the day before, she had decided to give away all the cash she had to those she loved, while she was still here to see their happiness in receiving it. This was supposed to happen anyway, right? Not like this. No, not a few days after my daughter's desperate need, and then her sudden transformation into a joyful state of mind. I know her imaginary act brought about this wonderful change, bringing not only great joy to the recipient, but also to the donor. P.S. I almost forgot that among the checks so generously given, there was also one for me for $10,000. The unlimited possibilities that open up by recognizing the shift in perspective of the imagination are immeasurable. There are no limits. The drama of life is an imaginary activity in which we make it happen through our states of mind rather than through our physical actions. States of mind skillfully direct all toward what they affirm. One might say they create life events and dictate events. The state of mind of the wish fulfilled is the high tide that easily lifts us out of the depths of the senses where we are normally stranded. If we are aware of the state of mind, and if we know this secret of imagination, we can announce that everything our state of mind affirms will come to pass. The next story is about a mother who managed to maintain what seemed to be a playful state of mind with astonishing results. You've surely heard of the grandmother's legend about warts, according to which if you buy a wart it will disappear. I've known this story since childhood, but it was only when I listened to your lectures that I realized the hidden truth in this old tale. My son, a 10-year-old boy, had many big and ugly warts on his legs, which had been bothering him for years. I decided that my sudden discovery could be used on him. A boy usually has a lot of faith in his mother, so I asked him if he wanted to quickly get rid of his warts. He said yes, but didn't want to go to the doctor. I proposed to play a little game with him, that I would pay him a sum of money for each wart. He agreed, saying he didn't see how he could lose. We came to a fair price according to him, and I told him, "Now, I'm paying you for these warts. They no longer belong to you. One never keeps someone else's property, so you can't keep these warts anymore. They will disappear. It may take a day, 2 days, or a month, but remember that I bought them and they belong to me." My son was delighted with our game, and the results resemble something read in old dusty magic books. But believe me, in 10 days the warts began to fade, and by the end of a month, all the warts on his body had completely disappeared. There is a sequel to this story, as I bought warts from many people. They too found it amusing and accepted my 5 or 10 cents per wart. In each case, the wart disappeared, but only one person believes me when I say that her imagination alone carried away the warts. That person is my young son, J.R. The man who imagines in a state of mind takes charge of the results of that state of mind. If he does not imagine himself in that state of mind, he is still free from the result. The great Irish mystic George William Russell wrote in The Sale of Vision, "I became aware of a quick echo or response to my own moods in circumstances which hitherto seemed immutable in their indifference. I could prophesy from the emergence of new states of mind within myself that I would soon meet persons of a certain character. And so I met them. Even inanimate things were under the sway of these affinities. But man need not wait for the emergence of new states of mind within himself. He can create happy states of mind at will. In Chapter 8 of Through the Looking Glass, a man looking at the glass can stop with his eye upon it, or if he prefers, can pass through it and then look at the sky. George Herbert said, "Objects must first penetrate in some manner into our brain to be perceived, but we are not entangled with our environment." Although normal consciousness focuses on the senses and is generally limited to them, it is possible for man to pass through his sensory fixation to any imaginary structure he conceives and to occupy it so completely that it is more alive and more receptive than the one his senses remain fixed upon. If this were not true, man would be an automaton reflecting life without ever affecting it. The man who is all imagination is not a tenant of the brain, but an owner. He need not be content with the appearance of things. He can go beyond perception to conceptual consciousness. This ability to pass through the mechanical reflexive structure of the senses is the most important discovery man can make. It reveals man as a center of imagination with intervening powers that enable him to alter the course of observed events, moving from success to success through a series of mental transformations within himself. Attention, the spearhead of imagination, can be drawn from without while the senses remain fixed on its eye, or directed from within if that is its desire, and through the senses pass to the wish fulfilled. To pass from perceptive consciousness, or things as they seem, to conceptual consciousness, or things as they should be, we imagine a representation as vivid and realistic as possible of what we would see, do, and experience if we were physically present and physically experiencing things as they should be, and we imaginatively participate in that scene. The following story tells how someone passed through the glass and broke the chains that held them back. 2 years ago, I was taken to the hospital with a serious blood clotting condition which seemed to have affected the entire vascular system, causing hardening of the arteries and arthritis. A nerve in my head was damaged and my thyroid was enlarged. Doctors could not agree on the cause of this condition and all their treatments were completely ineffective. I was forced to give up all my enjoyable activities and to stay in bed most of the time. My body, from the hips down to the feet, felt like it was wrapped and tied with tight strings, and I couldn't put my feet on the ground without wearing heavy elastic stockings up to the hips. I knew a little of your teaching and tried very hard to apply what I had heard. But as my condition worsened and I could no longer attend any of your lectures, my despair deepened. One day a friend sent me a postcard showing a beautiful beach near the ocean. The picture was so beautiful that I looked at it again and again, and I began to remember the summer days spent on the coast with my parents. For a moment, the picture on the postcard seemed to come alive, and filled my mind with memories of me running freely on the beach. I felt the impact of my bare feet on the hard, wet sand. I felt the cold water flowing over my toes, and I heard the crashing of the waves breaking on the shore. This imaginary activity was so satisfying to me as I lay in my bed that I continued to imagine this wonderful scene day after day for about a week. One morning, I moved from my bed to a couch and began to sit down when I was seized by such sharp pain that my whole body remained paralyzed. I could neither sit down nor lie down. This terrible pain lasted for more than a full minute, but when it stopped, I was free. It seemed that all the strings that tied my legs had been cut. One moment I was bound, the next I was free, not gradually, but instantly. We walk by faith, not by sight, 2 Corinthians 5:7. When we walk by sight, we know our way by the objects our eyes see. When we walk by faith, we order our life by scenes and actions that only the imagination sees. We perceive through the eye of imagination or through the senses, but there are two mental attitudes toward perception: the creative imaginative effort that meets an imaginative response, or the non-imaginative permanence of sight that is content to reflect. And in so doing, living the life of the state, and no longer our present life, imagination seizes the life of the state and engages in the expression of the life of that state. Faith plus love is a self-engagement. We do not need to engage in what we do not love. You would never have done anything if you had not loved it, for you love all things that exist, and nothing of what you have done you hate. For you would never have done anything if you hated it. For thou lovest all the things that are, and abhorrest none of the things which thou hast made. For never wouldest thou have made anything if thou hadst hated it. Book of Wisdom 11:24. And for the state to come alive, one must become alive, but not me. God lives in me, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in God who loved me and gave himself for me. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. God loved man, his creation, and became man in the faith that this act of self-engagement would transform the created into the Creator. We must be imitators of God as dear children, Ephesians 5:1, and engage in what we love, just as God who loved us engaged himself towards us. We must be the state to experience the state. The center of conscious imagination can change, and what is now mere desires, imaginative activities of low intensity, can be brought to a penetrating focus. Entry engages us with the state. The possibilities of changing the center of imagination in this way are endless. The activities in question are entirely psychic. The change in the center of imagination does not occur through spatial journeys, but through a change in what we are aware of. The limit of the world of the senses is a subjective barrier, and as long as the senses are awake, the eye of imagination is turned away from truth. We do not advance much unless we let go. This woman let go with immediate and miraculous results. Thank you for the golden key. She freed my brother from the hospital from pain and probable death. He was facing a fourth major operation with little hope of recovery. I was very worried and trying to use what I had learned about my imagination. First, I wondered what my brother really wanted. Does he want to stay in this body, or does he want to be released from it? The questions swirled in my head, and suddenly I felt he would like to continue remodeling his kitchen, which he had been considering before being confined to the hospital. I knew my question had been answered, so I started imagining from that point, trying to see him busy remodeling. Suddenly I found myself hanging on the back of a kitchen chair that I had used many times when something happened. Then suddenly I found myself standing by my brother's hospital bed. It was the last place I wanted to be, physically or mentally, but there I was, and my brother's hand rose and squeezed mine very tightly as I heard him say, "I knew you would come." It was a healthy hand that I held firmly and securely, and the joy that filled my voice and poured out as I said everything, "He is better now, you know." My brother did not respond, but I clearly heard a voice telling me, "Remember this moment." It felt like I then woke up at my home. This happened the night after he was admitted to the hospital. The next day, his wife called me to say, "It's amazing. The doctor can't understand it, but no operation is needed. He has improved so much that they have agreed to release him tomorrow." The following Monday, my brother returned to work, and he has been perfectly fine ever since. These are not the facts, but the dreams that shape our lives. She didn't need a compass to find her brother, or tools to operate, only the eye of imagination. In the world of the senses, we see what we must see. In the world of imagination, we see what we want to see. And in seeing it, we create it so that the world of the senses may see it. Seeing what we want to see requires a voluntary and conscious imaginative effort. Our future is our own imaginative activity in its creative momentum. Common sense assures us that we live in a solid and sensible world. But this apparently solid world is in reality imaginary as a whole. And if all this were just a dream, then everything we see or seems to be is just a dream within a dream. Sitting in my living room in San Francisco, I imagined I was in my daughter's living room in London, England. I surrounded myself with that room that I knew so intimately that suddenly I found myself actually standing in it. My daughter stood near the fireplace, her face turned away from me. A moment later, she turned around and our eyes met. I saw such a frightened and surprised expression on her face that I too was moved, and immediately found myself back in my living room in San Francisco. 5 days later, I received an airmail letter from my daughter that had been written on the day of my imaginary travel experience. In her letter, she told me that she had seen me in her living room that day, as real as if I were actually standing there. She confessed that she had been very frightened and that before she could speak, I had disappeared. The time of this visit, as she called it in her letter, was exactly the time when I had begun the imaginative action, allowing for the time difference between the 2 points. She explained that she had recounted this amazing experience to her husband, and he had insisted that she write to me immediately, asserting, "Your mother must be dead or dying." But I was neither dead nor dying, but very much alive and greatly excited by this wonderful experience. Nothing can act except where all my heart is. Thomas Carl, man is all imagination, so a man must be where he is in imagination, for his imagination is himself. Imagination is active in and through every state of which one is aware. If we take the change of consciousness seriously, there are possibilities beyond belief. The senses bind man in a forced and profane marriage with what, if imaginatively awake, would be separate. We do not need to feed on sensory data. Let's change the focus of consciousness and see what happens. Even if our mental movement is small, we should perceive the world in a slightly different light. Consciousness generally moves in space through the movement of the physical organism, but it is not obliged to be so restricted. It can move by changing what we are aware of. Man manifests the power of imagination, whose limits cannot be defined. Realizing that the true self, imagination, is not something confined within the spatial limit of the body is of paramount importance. The previous story demonstrates that when we meet a person in flesh and blood, their true self does not need to be present in the space where their body is. It also shows that sensory perception can be implemented outside of normal physical means, and that the sensory data produced are of the same type as those produced in normal perception. The idea in the mother's mind that initiated the whole process was the very definite idea of being where her daughter lived. And if the mother was really at that place, and if the daughter was present, then she should be perceptible to her daughter. We can only hope to understand this experience in imaginative terms and not in mechanical or materialistic terms. The mother imagined another place as being here. London was as much here for her daughter who lived there as San Francisco was here for the mother who lived there. Rarely do we think that this world could be essentially different from what common sense tells us it is. As Blake writes so eloquently, "I do not question my corporeal or vegetative eye any more than I would question a window in relation to a vision that I look through it and not with it." Looking through the eye not only changes consciousness to other parts of this world, but also to other worlds. Even astronomers must desire to know more about this gaze through the eye, this mental journey that mystics practice with such ease. Mental journey has been practiced by awake men and women. Since the early days, Paul asserts, I know a man in Christ who, 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows was caught up to the third heaven. 2 Corinthians 12. Paul tells us that he is this man and that he traveled by the power of imagination or Christ. In his next letter to the Corinthians he writes, "Examine yourselves." Corinthians 13:5. We do not need to be dead to enjoy spiritual privileges. Man is all imagination and God is man. William Blake. Annotations to Berkeley. Try it for yourself, as this mother did. Sir Arthur Eddington said that all we have the right to say about the outside world is that it is a shared experience. Things are more or less real according to the extent to which they can be shared with others or with ourselves at another time. But there is no clear and defined line. By accepting Eddington's definition of reality as a shared experience, the previous story is as real as the earth or a color, for it was shared by the mother and the daughter. The extent of imagination is such that I must confess that I do not know what its limits are, if any, of its ability to create reality. All these stories show us one thing. An imaginative activity involving fulfilled desire must begin in imagination, separate from sensory proof, in this journey that leads to the realization of desire. Chapter 9. Entry. If the spectator wanted to enter into these images in his imagination, approaching them in the burning chariot of his contemplative thought, if he could make one of these images a friend and companion of wonder, always asking her to abandon mortal things as she must know, then he would rise from his grave, then he would meet the Lord in the air, and then he would be happy. Blake seems to say that imagination will not realize anything we desire until we enter into the image of the fulfilled desire. Does this not resemble what Blake calls the void out of existence, which when entered enfolds and becomes a womb? Is not this the true interpretation of the mythic story of Adam and Eve? Man and his emanation are not the fanciful dreams of man, his emanation, his Eve, in which he plants himself in all his nerves, like a ploughman his mould, and she becomes his dwelling place and fertile garden. 70 times. William Blake, The Mental Traveller. The secret of creation is the secret of imagining first, by desiring, then by assuming the feeling of fulfilled desire, until the fantasy dream, the void out of existence, enters and enfolds itself and becomes a womb, a dwelling place, and fertile garden. 70 times. Note well that Blake urges us to enter into these images. Entering into the image enfolds it and becomes a womb. Man, by entering into a state, impregnates it and makes it create what union implies. Blake tells us that these images are dark to those who do not dwell in them, mere possibilities, but to those who enter into them, they seem to be the only substances. On my way to the West Coast, I made a stop in Chicago to spend the day with friends. My host was recovering from a serious illness, and his doctor had advised him to move into a one-story house. Following the doctor's advice, he had purchased a one-story house suited to his needs. But now he was facing the fact that there would be no more buyer for his large 3-story house. When I arrived, he was very discouraged. In trying to explain the law of constructive imagination to my host and his wife, I told them the story of a very distinguished woman from New York who had come to see me to rent her apartment. She owned a beautiful city apartment and a country house, but it was absolutely essential that she rent her apartment if she and her family were going to spend the summer in their country house. In previous years, the apartment had been rented without any problem in early spring, but by the time she came to see me, the summer rental season seemed to be over. Although the apartment had been in the hands of good real estate agents, no one seemed interested in renting it. I told her what she needed to do in her imagination. She did it, and within 24 hours her apartment was rented. I explained to them how, by constructively using her imagination, she had rented her apartment. Following my suggestion, before going to bed that night in her city apartment, she imagined herself lying in her bed, in her country house. In her imagination, she saw the world from the country house instead of the city apartment, feeling the fresh country air. She made it so real that she actually fell asleep, feeling like she was in the countryside. It was a Thursday night at 9 o'clock. The following Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, she called me from her country house and told me that on Friday, a highly desirable tenant, meeting all her criteria, had not only rented her apartment but had rented it with the condition of being able to move in the same day. I suggested to my friends to build an imaginary structure like this woman had done, that is, to sleep, imagining that they were physically present in their new home, feeling that they had sold their old house. I explained to them the great difference between thinking of the image of their new home and thinking from the image of their new home. Thinking of it is a confession that they are not there. Thinking from it is proof that they are there. Entering into the image would give substance to the image. Their physical occupation of the new home would automatically follow. I explained to them that how the world is seen depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observations. And man being all imagination, he must be where he is in imagination. This concept of causation disturbed them as it seemed magical or superstitious, but they promised to try. That night, I left for California, and the next afternoon, the train conductor I was traveling with handed me a telegram saying, "House sold at midnight." A week later, they wrote to tell me that the same night I had left Chicago, they had physically fallen asleep in the old house but mentally in the new one, seeing the world from the new home, imagining what things would look like if it were true. They were awakened that same night from their dream to be told that the house was sold. It is only when the image enters, when Eve is known, that the event bursts into the world. The accomplished desire must be conceived in man's imagination before the event can evolve from what Blake calls the void. The story demonstrates that by changing the focus of their imagination, Mrs. MF physically entered where she had persisted to be imaginatively. Shortly after our marriage, my husband and I decided that our greatest common desire was to spend a year in Europe. This goal may seem reasonable to many people, but for us, bound to a narrow sphere of limited finances, it seemed not only unreasonable but completely ridiculous. Europe might as well have been another planet. But I had heard your teaching. So, I persisted in falling asleep in England. Why England I cannot really say, except that I had seen a recent film showing the area around Buckingham Palace and had fallen in love with the scene. All I did in my imagination was to stand still before the large iron gates and feel the cold metal bars tight in my hands as I looked at the palace. For many, many nights I felt intense joy of being there and fell asleep in that happy state. Shortly after, my husband met a stranger at a party who, within a month, was instrumental in getting him a teaching fellowship at a major university. Imagine my excitement when I found out that the university was in England. Bound to a narrow sphere, within another month, we were crossing the Atlantic, and our supposed insurmountable difficulties melted away as if they had never existed. We had our year in Europe, one of the happiest years of my life. What the world seems to be depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observations, and man being all imagination must be where he is in imagination. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, Psalms 118:22. This stone is imagination. I acquaint you with this secret and leave you to act or react. This famous stone, that turns everything into gold, for what God touches and acknowledges cannot be lessened. George Herbert, The Elixir. My home is old, but it is mine. I wanted the exterior painted and the interior redecorated, but I had no money to accomplish either of these goals. You told us to live as if our desire were already a reality, and that's what I began to do. I imagined my old house with a fresh coat of paint, new furniture, new decor, and all the trimmings. I walked in my imagination through the freshly decorated rooms, strolled outside admiring the fresh paint, and at the end of my imaginary act, I handed the contractor a check for full payment. I entered into this imaginary scene faithfully as often as possible during the day and every night before falling asleep. In 2 weeks, I received a registered letter from Lloyd's of London informing me that I had inherited $7,000 from a woman I had never met. I had known her brother somewhat nearly 40 years ago and had done him a small favor 15 years ago when the lady's brother died in our country, and she had written to me for details about his death, which I had been able to provide. I hadn't heard from her since, and now here was the $7,000 check, more than enough to cover the cost of restoring my house, as well as many other things I desired. He who does not imagine in stronger and better lines, and in brighter and better light than his mortal and perishing eye, cannot imagine at all. Blake. Unless the individual imagines himself as someone else or somewhere else, the present ions and circumstances of his life will continue to exist, and his problems will repeat themselves, for all events renew themselves from his constant images. They were created by him, they continue to exist by him, and can cease to exist by him. The secret of causality lies in the assembled images, but a word of caution. The whole must make sense, it must imply something, otherwise it will not form creative activity. The things which are not seen are made of things which are not seen. Hebrews 11:3. Human history, with its forms of government, revolutions, wars, and indeed the rise and fall of nations, could be written in terms of the rise and fall of ideas implanted in the minds of men. Herbert Huber. The secret of imagination is the greatest of all problems to which the mystic aspires. The supreme power, supreme wisdom, supreme pleasure reside in the far-off solution of this mystery. Douglas Faucet. To deny the creative power of man's invisible and imaginative activity is too great to be discussed. Man, by his imaginative activity, literally calls into existence things which do not exist. Romans 4:17. By man's imaginative activity, all things are created, and without such activity nothing that was made was made. John 1:3. Such causal activity could be defined as an imaginative assembly of images which, inevitably occurring, gives rise to a physical event. It is up to us to assemble images of a happy outcome, and then to refrain from interfering with the event. The event must not be forced, but must be allowed to happen. If imagination is the only thing that acts, or is in the existing beings of men, as Blake believed, then we should never be sure that it was not a woman who, by treading the winepress, initiated that subtle change in men's minds. William Butler Yeats. This grandmother treads the winepress daily for her granddaughter. She writes, "This is one of those things that make my family and friends say, 'We simply do not understand.'" Kim is 2.5 now. I took care of her for a month after her birth, and didn't see her again until a year later, and then only for 2 weeks. Yet over the past year, every day, I have had her on my lap in my imagination. I have caressed her and talked to her in these imaginary acts. I review all the wonderful things about Kim. God grows through me, God loves through me, etc. At first I got the response of a very young child. When I started, "God grows through me," she would respond, "Me." Now when I start, she completes the entire sentence. Another thing that happened is that as the months passed, when I would take her on my lap in my imagination, she would consistently grow, becoming taller and heavier. Kim hasn't even seen a picture of me in the past year. At best, I could just be a name for her now. Occasionally, every day, her family tells me she's starting to talk about me without talking to anyone in particular. Just talking. Sometimes it goes on for an hour, or she picks up the phone and pretends to call. In her monologue, fragments are included like, "My Didi loves me. My Didi always comes to see me every day." Although I know what I've been doing in my imagination, it also made me think a lot. All imaginative men and women are constantly casting enchantments, and all passive men and women who do not have powerful imaginative lives are continually under the spell of their power. There is no form in nature that is not produced and sustained by some imaginative activity. Therefore, any change in imaginative activity must result in a corresponding change in form. Imagining a substitute image for an unadded or defective content is creating it. If we simply persist in our ideal imaginative activity and do not let minor satisfactions suffice, victory will be ours. When I read Sow and Reap, the story of the teacher who, by her imagination in daily revision, turned a delinquent student into a lovely little girl, I decided to do something for a youngster at my husband's school. To explain all the problems involved would take pages, for my husband had never had such a difficult child or such a difficult parent situation. The boy was too young to be expelled, but teachers refused to have him in their classes. To make matters worse, The mother and grandmother literally camped on the school grounds, causing problems for everyone. I wanted to help the boy, but I also wanted to help my husband. So, every night, I built 2 scenes in my imagination. One where I saw a perfectly normal and happy boy, and 2 where I heard my husband say, "I can't believe it, honey, but you know R is acting like a normal child now, and it's heaven not to have those 2 women here anymore." After 2 months of persisting in my imaginary play, night after night, my husband came home and said, "It's like paradise at the school." Not exactly the same words, but close enough for me. The grandmother had become involved in something that took her out of town, and the mother had to go with her. At the same time, a new teacher had taken up the challenge of R and was progressing wonderfully toward everything I had imagined for him. It is useless to maintain standards that we do not apply. Unlike Portia, who said, "I could more easily teach 20 what to do than to be one of the 20 to follow my own teaching." Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice. I followed my own teaching. It is fatally easy to make the acceptance of imaginative faith a substitute for living by it. He hath sent me to bind up the broken-hearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Isaiah 61:1. O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou art our potter. We are all the work of thy hand. Isaiah 64:8. This conception of creation as the work of imagination and the Lord our Father as our imagination will lead us deeper into the mystery of creation than any other guide. The only reason people do not believe in this identity between God and human imagination is that they are not willing to take responsibility for the terrible misuse of imagination. Divine imagination has descended to the level of human imagination so that human imagination can rise to divine imagination. The 8th Psalm says that man was made a little lower than God, not a little lower than the angels, as incorrectly translated in the King James Version. Angels are the emotional dispositions of man, and are therefore his servants, not his superiors, as the author of Hebrews tells us. Imagination is the real man, and is one with God. Imagination creates, preserves, and transforms. Imagination is radically creative. When all imaginative activity based on memory disappears, imagination is conservative. When its imaginative activity is fueled by images primarily provided by memory, imagination is transformative. When it varies an already existing theme, when it mentally alters a fact of life, when it omits the fact of the memorized experience or puts something in its place, if it disrupts the harmony it desires through the use of its imagination. This talented young artist transformed her dream into reality. Since I entered the field of art, I have enjoyed making drawings and paintings for children's rooms. However, I was discouraged by counselors and friends who had much more experience in the field than I did. They liked my work, admired my talent, but said I would receive neither recognition nor payment for this type of work. Somehow, I always felt I would. But how? Then last autumn, I listened to your lectures and read your books, and I decided to let my imagination create the reality I desired. That's what I did every day. I imagined I was in a gallery, that there was much excitement around me. On the walls were my works, only mine, a solo exhibition, and I saw red price tags on many images. That would indicate they had been sold. That's what happened just before Christmas. I made a mobile for a friend who showed it to her friend, who owns an art import shop in Pasadena. He expressed a desire to meet me, so I brought some samples of my work. When he saw the first painting, he said he would like to give me a solo exhibition in the spring. On opening night, April 17th, an interior decorator came and liked my work. He commissioned a collage for a child's room to appear in the September issue of Good Housekeeping for the House of the year 1961. Later, at the exhibition, another decorator came and admired my work so much that he asked if I could meet the right interior decorators and gallery owners who would buy and exhibit my work properly. Furthermore, the exhibition was a financial success for both the gallery owner and me. What is interesting is that these 3 men seemed to come to me out of nowhere. Certainly, I made no effort during my time of imagination to contact anyone, but now I am receiving recognition and have a market for my work. And now I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no no when one seriously applies this principle that imagination creates reality. She tested the potter and proved her creativity in execution. Only the indolent mind would fail at this challenge. Paul affirms, "The Spirit of God dwells in you." 1 Corinthians 3:16. Now, examine yourself, test yourself. Do not fail the test. I hope you will find that we have not failed. 2 Corinthians 13:5-6. If all things were made by him, and without him nothing was made that was made. John 1:3. It should not be difficult for man to test himself to find out who this Creator in him is. The test will demonstrate to man that his imagination is the only one that brings the dead to life and calls into existence things that do not exist. Romans 4:17. The presence of the potter in us is deduced from what he does there. We cannot see him there, just as one is not ourselves. The nature of the potter, Jesus Christ, is to create, and there is no creation without him. Every story recorded in this book is precisely proof, as Paul requested of the Corinthians to do. God truly exists and truly in man, in every human being. God is completely transformed in us. He is not our virtue, but our real being, our imagination. The following illustrations from the mineral world can help us see how supreme imagination and human imagination could be one and the same power, yet vastly different in their creativity. Diamond is the hardest mineral in the world. Graphite, used in pencils, is one of the softest, yet both minerals are pure carbon. It is believed that the vast difference in the properties of the two forms of carbon is due to a different arrangement of carbon atoms. But whether the difference is produced by a different arrangement of carbon atoms or not, all agree that diamond and graphite are one and the same substance, pure carbon. The purpose of life is the creative realization of desire. Man, devoid of desire, could not exist effectively in a world of continuous problems requiring continual solutions. Desire is an awareness of something lacking or needed to make life more enjoyable. Desires always have some personal benefit in mind. The greater the anticipated gain, the more intense the desire will be. There truly is no unselfish desire. Even when our desire is for another, we still seek to satisfy a desire to fulfill our own desire. To fulfill our desire, we must imagine scenes involving their realization. And to represent the scene in our imagination, even momentarily, with enough felt joy within its limits to make it natural, is like a child dressing up and playing queen. We must imagine ourselves to be what we would like to be. We must play it first in imagination, not as spectators but as actors. This woman imaginatively played the role of queen by being where she wanted to be in her imagination. She was the true actress in that theatre. My desire was to attend a morning performance of a famous pantomime playing in one of the largest theatres in our city. Because of the intimate nature of this art, I wanted to sit in the orchestra, but I didn't even have the price of a balcony ticket. The night I decided to indulge myself in my imagination, I fell asleep watching the wonderful performer in my imaginary act. I sat in a seat in the center of the orchestra, heard the applause as the curtain rose, and the artist stepped on stage and truly felt the intense emotion of that experience. The next day, the morning of the matinee, my financial situation hadn't changed. I had exactly $1.37 in my purse. I knew I had to use the dollar to buy gas for my car, leaving me with 37 cents, but I also knew I had faithfully slept, feeling I was at that performance. So, I dressed to go to the theater. While transferring items from one purse to another, I found a $5 bill in change hidden in the pocket of my seldom-used purse. I smiled, realizing the money for gas had been provided, so they would also give me the balance of my ticket for the theater. Joyfully, I finished dressing and went out to the theater. Standing at the ticket office, my confidence dwindled as I looked at the prices and saw $3.75 for orchestra seats. With a feeling of dismay, I quickly walked away and crossed the street to have a cup of tea in a cafe. I spent $1.60 for my tea before remembering I had seen the price of balcony tickets on the ticket office list. Hastily counting my change, I found I had $1.66 left. Hurrying back to the theater, I purchased the cheapest available seat, which cost 55 cents. With a penny left in my purse, I went through the entrance, and the usher tore my ticket in half, saying, Top left, please." The performance was about to begin, but ignoring the usher's instructions, I went into the ground floor ladies' restroom, still determined to sit in the orchestra section. I sat down, closed my eyes, and held my inner vision fixed on the stage from the direction of the orchestra. At that moment, a group of women entered the restroom, all talking at once, but I only heard one conversation, when a woman said to her companion, "But I waited and waited until the last minute. Then she called and said she couldn't come. She would have her ticket, but it's too late now." Unconsciously, I handed the usher the 2 tickets, and he tore them before I could stop him. I nearly laughed out loud. Rising, I approached the woman and asked if I could use the extra ticket she had instead of the balcony ticket I had bought. She was charming and kindly invited me to join her group. The ticket she gave me was for the center orchestra section, 6 rows from the stage. I sat in that seat just before the curtain rose for a performance I had seen the night before, from that same seat in my imagination. We really must be in imagination. It is one thing to think of the end, and another to think from the end. Thinking from the end, representing the end, is to create reality. Internal actions must correspond to the actions we would physically perform after that. Edward Thomas said, "To live wisely, we must be aware of our imaginative activity and ensure that it faithfully shapes the end we desire. The world is clay, our imagination is the potter. We must always imagine ends that are worthwhile or promise good. He who desires but does not act breeds pestilence." William Blake said, "What is done comes from what is imagined. External forms reveal the imaginations of man. Man is the shuttle through which God ordered the movement, but not the rest." Henry Bogan said, "I have a small proprietary business, and a few years ago it seemed that my business was going to fail. For a few months, sales had been steadily declining, and I found myself in a desperate financial situation, like thousands of other small entrepreneurs. As this period coincided with one of the minor recessions in our country, I was heavily in debt and needed at least $10,000 almost immediately. My auditors advised me to close my doors and try to salvage what I could. Instead, I appealed to my imagination. I knew your teaching, but I had never really tried to solve any problems this way. Honestly, I was skeptical of the whole idea that imagination could create reality, but I was also desperate, and desperation forced me to try your teaching. I imagined my office unexpectedly receiving $40,000 in pending refunds. This money should come from new orders, as my accounts receivable virtually did not exist. But it seemed unlikely, as I had not received that amount in sales for the past 4 months or more. However, I kept my imaginary image of receiving this amount of money constantly before me. On the 3rd day, early in the morning of the 4th day, a customer I hadn't heard from in months called me on the phone and asked me to come see him personally. I was to bring him a quote I had given him before for the machinery needed in his factory. The quote was several months old, but I pulled it out of my files and quickly went to his office that day. I wrote up the order, which he signed, but I saw no immediate help in the transaction, as the equipment he wanted would take 4 to 6 months to be delivered to the factory, and of course my customer would not have to pay for it until it was delivered. I thanked him for the order and stood up to leave. He stopped me at the door and handed me a check for over $4,000, saying, "I want to pay for the merchandise now in advance for tax reasons. You don't mind, do you?" No, I didn't mind. I realized what had happened the moment I took that check into my hands. In 3 days, my imaginary act had done for me what I had not been able to do in months of desperate financial turmoil. I now know that my imagination could have brought $40,000 into my business as easily as $4,000. O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. Isaiah 64:8. And representing the scene in our imagination, even momentarily, with enough felt joy within its limits to make it natural, is like a child dressing up and playing queen. We must imagine ourselves to be what we would like to be. We must play it first in the imagination, not as spectators, but as actors. This woman imaginatively played the role of queen by being where she wanted to be in her imagination. She was the true actress in that theatre. My desire was to attend a morning performance of a famous pantomime playing in one of the largest theatres in our city. Because of the intimate nature of this art, I wanted to sit in the orchestra, but I didn't even have the price of a balcony ticket. The night I decided to indulge myself in my imagination, I fell asleep watching the wonderful performer in my imaginary act. I sat in a seat in the center of the orchestra, heard the applause as the curtain rose and the artist stepped onto the stage, and truly felt the intense emotion of that experience. The next day, the morning of the matinee, my financial situation hadn't changed. I had exactly $1.37 in my purse. I knew I had to use the dollar to buy gas for my car, leaving me with 37 cents. But I also knew I had faithfully slept, feeling I was at that performance. So, I dressed to go to the theater. While transferring items from one purse to another, I found a $5 bill in change hidden in the pocket of my seldom-used purse. I smiled, realizing the money for gas had been provided. So, they would also give me the balance of my ticket for the theater. Joyfully, I finished dressing and went out to the theater. Standing at the ticket office, my confidence dwindled as I looked at the prices and saw $3.75 for orchestra seats. With a feeling of dismay, I quickly walked away and crossed the street to have a cup of tea in a cafe. I spent $1.60 for my tea before remembering I had seen the price of balcony tickets on the ticket office list. Hastily counting my change, I found I had $1.66 left. Hurrying back to the theater, I purchased the cheapest available seat, which cost 55 cents. With a penny left in my purse, I went through the entrance, and the usher tore my ticket in half, saying, "Top left, please." The performance was about to begin, but ignoring the usher's instructions, I went into the ground floor ladies' restroom, still determined to sit in the orchestra section. I sat down, closed my eyes, and held my inner vision fixed on the stage from the direction of the orchestra. At that moment, a group of women entered the restroom, all talking at once, but I only heard one conversation, when a woman said to her companion, "But I waited and waited until the last minute. Then she called and said she couldn't come. She would have her ticket, but it's too late now." Unconsciously, I handed the usher the 2 tickets, and he tore them before I could stop him. I nearly laughed out loud. Rising, I approached the woman and asked if I could use the extra ticket she had instead of the balcony ticket I had bought. She was charming and kindly invited me to join her group. The ticket she gave me was for the center, orchestra section 6 rows from the stage. I sat in that seat just before the curtain rose for a performance I had seen the night before from that same seat in my imagination. We really must be in imagination. It is one thing to think of the end and another to think from the end. Thinking from the end, representing the end, is to create reality. Internal actions must correspond to the actions we would physically perform after that. Edward Thomas said, "To live wisely, we must be aware of our imaginative activity and ensure that it faithfully shapes the end we desire. The world is clay. Our imagination is the potter. We must always imagine ends that are worthwhile or promise good. He who desires but does not act breeds pestilence." William Blake said, "What is done comes from what is imagined." External forms reveal the imaginations of man. Man is the shuttle through which God ordered the movement but not the rest. Henry Bogan said, "I have a small proprietary business, and a few years ago, it seemed that my business was going to fail. For a few months, sales had been steadily declining, and I found myself in a desperate financial situation, like thousands of other small entrepreneurs. As this period coincided with one of the minor recessions in our country, I was heavily in debt and needed at least $10,000 almost immediately. My auditors advised me to close my doors and try to salvage what I could. Instead, I appealed to my imagination. I knew your teaching, but I had never really tried to solve any problems this way. Honestly, I was skeptical of the whole idea that imagination could create reality, but I was also desperate, and desperation forced me to try your teaching. I imagined my office unexpectedly receiving $40,000 in pending refunds. This money should come from new orders, as my accounts receivable virtually did not exist. But it seemed unlikely, as I had not received that amount in sales for the past 4 months or more. However, I kept my imaginary image of receiving this amount of money constantly before me. On the 3rd day, Early in the morning of the fourth day, a customer I hadn't heard from in months called me on the phone and asked me to come see him personally. I was to bring him a quote I had given him before for the machinery needed in his factory. The quote was several months old, but I pulled it out of my files and quickly went to his office that day. I wrote up the order which he signed, but I saw no immediate help in the transaction, as the equipment he wanted would take 4 to 6 months to be delivered to the factory, and of course my customer would not have to pay for it until it was delivered. I thanked him for the order and stood up to leave. He stopped me at the door and handed me a check for over $4,000, saying, "I want to pay for the merchandise now in advance, for tax reasons. You don't mind, do you?" No, I didn't mind. I realized what had happened the moment I took that check into my hands. In 3 days, my imaginary act had done for me what I had not been able to do in months of desperate financial turmoil. I now know that my imagination could have brought $40,000 into my business as easily as $4,000. O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. Isaiah 64:8. Chapter 12. Attitudes. Mental things are the only real ones. What is called corporeal, nobody knows where it resides. It is in the fallacy and its existence is an impostor. Where is existence outside the mind or thought? Where is it, if not in the mind of a fool? Blake memory, though defective, is adequate for the call of likeness. If we remember another as we knew them, we recreate them in that image, and the past will be recognized in the present. Imagination creates reality. If there is room for improvement, we should rebuild it with new content. Visualize it as we would like it to be instead of letting it be burdened by our memory of it. All that can be believed is an image of truth. Blake. The following story is that of someone who believes that imagination creates reality, and that acting upon this belief changed his attitude towards a stranger and witnessed this change in reality. Over 20 years ago, as a young farmer newly arrived in Boston to attend school, a beggar asked me for money for a meal. Although the money I had was unfortunately insufficient for my own needs, I gave him what I had in my pocket. A few hours later, the same man, already drunk, stopped me again and asked me for money. I was furious at the thought that the money I could barely afford had been used in this way, and I made a solemn oath never to listen to a beggar's plea on the street again. Over the years I kept my oath, but every time I refused something to someone, my conscience punished me. I felt guilty, even to the point of developing a strong stomachache, but I couldn't afford to waver. Earlier this year, a man stopped me while I was walking my dog and asked me for money to eat. True to the oath I had taken in the past, I refused him. His behavior was kind in accepting my refusal. He even admired my dog and talked about a family in New York State he knew who raised cockers. This time my conscience really pricked me as he walked away. I decided to replay this scene as I would have wished it. I stopped in the middle of the street, closed my eyes for a few moments, and represented the scene differently in my imagination. The same man came towards me, but this time he opened the conversation by admiring my dog. After talking for a while, I made him say, "I hate to ask you this, but I really need something to eat. I have a job starting tomorrow morning, but I've been unemployed and hungry tonight." Then I took out a $5 bill from my imaginary pocket and gave it to him with joy. This imaginary act immediately dissolved the feeling of guilt and pain. I know from your teaching that an imaginary act is a fact, so I knew I could grant anyone what they asked for, and by having faith in the imaginary act, consent to the reality of them receiving it. A few months later, while walking my dog again, the same man came towards me and opened the conversation by admiring my dog. "You have a beautiful dog there," he said. "I don't think you remember me, but some time ago, I asked you for money, and you kindly said no." I say kindly because if you had given me money, I would still be asking for it. On the other hand, I found a job that morning, and now I stand up and have a little pride again. I knew his job was a fact when I imagined it that night 4 months ago, but I would deny it if I didn't acknowledge that there was immense satisfaction in seeing it confirmed in person. "I have neither silver nor gold," I said to him, But what I have, I give you. Acts 3:6. No one should be thrown away, all must be saved. And our imagination, reconfiguring memory, is the process by which this is accomplished. Condemning man for losing his way is punishing the man already punished. Whom should I pity if I do not pity the lost sinner? William Blake, Jerusalem. We should not focus on what man has been, but on what he can become. Our imaginative activity, do you remember sweet Alice Benbolt, sweet Alice, whose hair was so brown it wept for joy when you smiled at her and trembled with fear when you frowned? George Maurier. If we imagine nothing worse for him than what he imagines himself, he will pass as excellent. It is not man at his best moment, but the imaginer. Exercising the spirit of forgiveness that accomplishes the miracle. Imagining with new content transformed both the man who asked and the one who gave. Imagination has not yet received the recognition it deserves, neither from moralists nor educators. When it does, prison doors will open for those who are bound. Isaiah 61:1. Nothing has existence for us except by the memory we have of it. We should therefore remember it not as it was, unless of course that was entirely desirable, but as we would like it to be, since imagination is creative. Our agreement with another encourages or restrains him and facilitates or hinders his way up or down. There is no coal of character so dead it will not glow and flame if lightly turned. The following story shows that imagination can create wedding rings and lead people to China. My husband, the son of a broken home and raised by loving grandparents, was never close to his mother, and she to him. A 63-year-old woman, divorced for 32 years. She was alone and bitter, and my relationship with her was strained as I tried to remain neutral. By her own admission, her great desire was to remarry for companionship, but she thought it was impossible at her age. My husband often told me he hoped she would remarry, and as he expressed it fervently, perhaps live far away from the city, had the same desire, and as I expressed it, perhaps move to China. Being careful with my personal motive for this desire, I knew I had to change my feelings towards her in my imaginary drama, and at the same time give her what she desired. I started seeing her in my imagination as a completely transformed person, a happy, joyful, confident, and contented woman in a new relationship. Every time I thought of her, I mentally saw her as a new woman. About 3 weeks later, she came to visit us at home with a friend she had met several months before. The man had just lost his wife, was the same age as her, financially secure, and had adult children and grandchildren. We enjoyed them, and I was excited because it was evident that they appreciated each other. But my husband still thought it was impossible. Not me. From that day on, every time her image came into my mind, I saw her reaching out her left hand to me and admiring the ring on her finger. A month later, she and her friend came to visit us again, and as I approached to greet them, she proudly extended her left hand. The ring was on her finger. 2 weeks later, they got married, and we haven't seen her since. She lives in a new house far away from the city, and as her new husband doesn't like the long trip to our place, she might as well have emigrated to China. There is a great difference between the will to resist an activity and the decision to change it. He who changes an activity acts, while he who resists an activity reacts. One creates, the other perpetuates. Nothing is real outside the imaginative patterns we create. Memory, just like desire, resembles a dream. Why turn it into a nightmare? Man can only forgive if he treats memory as a dream and shapes it according to the desire of his heart. I have learned that we can deprive others of their abilities with our attitudes towards them. I changed my attitude, and with that I changed a fact. I am not a lender, not in the realm of investments as such, but a friend and business associate came to me asking for a substantial loan to expand their factory. Because of our personal friendship, I granted it at reasonable interest rates and gave them the right of renewal at the end of 1 year. When the first year expired, they were behind on interest payments and requested a 30-day extension for the promissory note. I granted this request, but at the end of the 30 days, they still couldn't pay the promissory note and asked for an additional extension. As I mentioned earlier, I do not lend money. In 20 days I needed full payment of the loan to honor my own debts, but I consented again to extend the promissory note. Although my own credit is now in serious jeopardy, it would have been natural to exert legal pressure to recover the amount due, and a few years ago I would have done that. Instead, I recalled your warning not to steal others' capacity, and I realized that I had deprived my friend of his ability to pay what he owed. For 3 nights, I constructed a scene in my imagination where I heard my friend telling me that unexpected orders had flooded his desk so rapidly that he could now repay the loan in full. On the 4th day, I received a phone call from him. He told me that by what he called a miracle, he had received so many orders, and big ones at that he could now repay me my loan, including all the interest due, and that he had just sent me a check for the total amount. There is nothing more fundamental to the secret of imagination than the distinction between imagining and the imagined state. Mental things alone are real. All that can be believed is an image of truth. William Blake. Chapter 13. To every tribe, general knowledge is distant knowledge. In details lies wisdom and also happiness. Blake. We must use our imagination to attain particular ends, even if the ends are trivial, because men do not clearly define and imagine particular ends. The results are uncertain. Though they might be perfectly true, imagining particular ends is clearly discriminative. How do we distinguish oak from beech, horse from ox, except by the defined outline? Blake. Divine human form, definition, asserts the reality of the particular thing against the formless generalizations that flood the mind. Life on earth is a kindergarten for the creation of images. The greatness or smallness of the object to be created is not important in itself. The grand and golden rule of art, as well as of life, says Blake, is this: the more distinct and sharp the outline lines, the more perfect the work of art, and the less distinct and sharp they are, the greater the evidence of feeble imitation. Who builds a house and plants a garden, if not that which is defined and determined? Omit this line, and you exclude life itself. The following stories concern the acquisition of apparently small things, or toys as I call them, but they are important because of the clear imaginary images they have created. The author of the first story is someone who is said to have everything. It is true she has financial, social, and intellectual security. She writes, as you know, through your teaching and my practice of that teaching, I have completely transformed myself, as well as my life. 2 weeks ago, when you spoke of toys, I realized that I had never used my imagination to obtain things, and I decided it would be fun to try. You told the story of a girl who was given a hat simply by imagining it. The last thing I needed on earth was a hat, but I wanted to try my imagination to obtain things, so I selected a hat that appeared in a fashion magazine, cut out the image, and glued it to the mirror of my dressing table. I studied the image carefully, then closed my eyes, and in my imagination, I put on the hat and wore it out of the house. I did it only once. The following week, I found myself with friends for lunch, and one of them was wearing the hat. We all admired it. The next day, I received a package by special messenger. The hat was in the package. The friend who wore it the day before had sent it to me with a note saying she didn't particularly like the hat and didn't know why she had bought it in the first place, but for some reason, she thought it would suit me, and could I please accept it? GL. The movement of dreams towards things is the driving force of humanity. We must live entirely on the level of imagination, and this must be consciously and deliberately taken care of. All my life, I have loved birds, loved watching them, listening to their chatter, feeding them, and I have become particularly attached to the little sparrows. For many months I gave them breadcrumbs in the morning, wild bird seed, and anything else I thought they would eat. During all those months, I felt frustrated seeing the big birds, especially pigeons, dominate the area, devouring most of the good food and leaving the shells for my sparrows. At first it seemed ridiculous to use my imagination to solve this problem, but the more I thought about it, the more interesting the idea became. So, one night, I began to see the little birds arrive and receive their full share of the daily offerings, and I told my wife that the pigeons were no longer interfering with my sparrows, but were taking their share like gentlemen, then leaving the area. I continued this imaginary action for almost a month. Then one morning, I noticed the pigeons were gone. The sparrows had breakfast to themselves for a few days. During those few days, no big bird entered the area. Eventually they came back, but to this day they have never invaded the area occupied by my sparrows. They stay together, eating what I put out for them, leaving a whole part of the area for my little friends. And you know what? I really believe the sparrows understand. They don't seem afraid anymore when I walk among them. RK. This lady demonstrates that if our heart is not in the task, if we do not imagine ourselves exactly in the feeling of our accomplished desire, we are not there, for we are all imagination, and we must be where and what we are in imagination. In early February, my husband and I had been in our new home for a month, a charming house beyond description, perched on a steep cliff with the ocean in front, the wind and sky as neighbors and seagulls as guests. We were ecstatic. If you have ever experienced the joy and sadness of building your own home, you know how completely filled with happiness you are and how completely empty your pocket is. 100 charming things claimed to be bought for this house. But what we wanted most of all was the most useless, a painting. Not just any painting, but a marvelous and wild seascape dominated by a large white sailboat. This image had been in our thoughts throughout the months of construction, and we left one wall of the living room unpainted to accommodate it. My husband mounted decorative red and green ship lanterns on the wall to frame our picture, but the picture itself would have to wait. Curtains, rugs, all the practical items had to come first, maybe. But that didn't stop either of us from seeing that picture in our imagination on that wall. One day, while I was shopping, I entered a small art gallery, and as I stepped through the door, I stopped abruptly, and a man walking behind me bumped into an easel. I apologized and pointed to a painting hung at eye level on the other side of the room. "That's what did it," he said to me. "I've never seen anything so wonderful." He introduced himself as the gallery owner and said, "Yes, it's an original by the greatest English painter of sailboats the world has known." He went on to tell me about the artist, but I wasn't listening. I couldn't take my eyes off that marvelous boat. And then I suddenly felt something very strange. It was just a moment in time, but the art gallery vanished and I saw that painting on my wall. I fear the owner may have thought I was a bit scatterbrained, and I was, but I finally managed to bring my attention back to his voice when he mentioned an astronomical price. I smiled and said, "Perhaps someday." He continued to talk to me about the painter, as well as an American artist who was the only living lithographer capable of copying the great English master. He said, "If you're very lucky, you might get one of his prints. I've seen his work, it's perfect down to the last detail. Many people prefer prints to paintings." Prints or paintings, I knew nothing of the values of either. And anyway, all I wanted was that scene. When my husband came home that evening, I talked only about that painting and begged him to visit the gallery and see it. "Perhaps we can find a print somewhere," I said. "Yes," he interrupted, "but you know we can't afford to take a painting now." Our conversation ended there, but that night after dinner, I stood in our living room and I saw that painting on our wall. The next day, my husband had an appointment with a client he didn't want to keep, but the appointment went ahead, and my husband didn't come home until after dark. When he walked in through the front door, I was busy elsewhere in the house, and I called out to greet him a few minutes later. I heard hammering, so I walked into the living room to see what he was doing. Our painting was hung on the wall. In my first moment of intense joy, I remembered the man from the art gallery saying, "If you're very lucky, you might get one of his prints." Lucky? Well, here's my husband's part of this story. In making the call I mentioned earlier, he entered one of the poorest, most miserable houses he had ever seen. The client showed up and took my husband into a small, dark dining room, where they both sat at a table without a tablecloth. When my husband laid his napkin on the table, he looked up and saw the painting hung on the wall. He confessed to me that he conducted a very careless interview because he couldn't take his eyes off that painting. The client signed the contract and handed over a check as an initial payment, which, according to my husband, at that time he believed was short by Dale. In mentioning this fact to the client, He said the check handed over represented every penny he could afford, but he added, "I noticed your interest in that painting. It was here when I took this place. I don't know who it belonged to, but I don't want it. If you put in $10 more, you can take it off my hands." When my husband returned to his company's headquarters, he found that he had made a mistake about the amount. He wasn't short, Dyer. Our painting is on our wall, and it cost us nothing. To Dr. R.L., who writes the following letter, one should truly say, "Madam, you have a merry heart." William Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing. One day, during a bus strike, I needed to go downtown and had to walk 10 blocks from my home to the nearest operating bus stop. Before heading home, I remembered there was no grocery store on this new route, and I wouldn't be able to buy dinner. I had enough to put together an improvised meal, but I would need bread. After walking all day, the 10 blocks to the bus stop were all I could bear, and going further to buy bread was out of the question. I stopped for a moment and let a vision of bread dance in my head. Then I started walking home. When I got on the bus, I was so tired that I grabbed the first available seat and almost sat on a paper bag. Now, in a bus full of weary passengers, people rarely look directly at each other. So, being naturally curious, I peeked inside the bag. Sure enough, it was a loaf of bread. Not just any bread, but the same brand of bread I always buy. Nonsense, just nonsense, but it produced its frivolities at no cost. Imagination achieved these things without the means usually considered necessary to do so. Man values wealth in a way that has no relation to real values. Come buy without money and without price wine and milk, Isaiah 55:1. Chapter 14. The Creative Moment. The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they seem foolish to him, nor can he understand them because they must be spiritually discerned. 1 Corinthians 2:14. There is a moment in every day that Satan cannot find, nor his demon watchers can find it. But the industrious find this moment and multiply it, and once found, it renews every moment of the day. If placed correctly, every moment of the day is renewed. William Blake. Whenever we imagine things as they should be instead of as they seem to be, that's the moment. Because in that moment, the work of the spiritual man is accomplished, and all the great events of time begin to shape a world in harmony with the altered pattern of that moment. Satan is a reactor. He never acts alone, but always reacts. And if our attitude toward the events of the day is reactionary, we are not playing Satan's role. Man reacts only in his natural or satanic state. He never acts or creates alone, but reacts or recreates a creative moment. A true feeling of accomplished desire is worth more than all natural life of reaction. In that moment, God's work is done anew. We can say with Blake that God acts alone, and he acts in existing beings or men. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, 1793. There exists an imaginary past and an imaginary future. If, in reacting, the past is recreated in the present, then, in acting, our fanciful dreams can bring the future into the present. To feel the future now, in the present moment. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. The spiritual man acts for himself. Whatever he wants to do, he can do it, and do it immediately in his imagination. And his motto is always, "The moment is now." Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6, Mark 2. Nothing stands between man and the realization of his dream except facts, and facts are the creations of the imagination. This story recounts the experience of a young woman who entered the moment and, by acting on her fanciful dream, brought the future into the present instant, without realizing what she had done until the final scene. The following incident may seem like a coincidence to those who have never been exposed to your teachings, but I know I witnessed an imaginary act take solid form in perhaps 4 minutes. I think you will find it interesting to read this account, written exactly as it occurred a few minutes after the actual event. Yesterday morning, I was driving my car east on Sunset Boulevard in the center lane, slowing gently to stop at a red light at a 3-way intersection when my attention was captured by the sight of an old lady dressed entirely in grey, running in front of my car. She had her arm raised, pointing at the driver of a bus pulling away from the curb. Clearly, she was trying to cross in front of the bus to slow it down. The driver slowed his vehicle, and I thought he would let her board. Instead, when she jumped onto the sidewalk, the bus pulled away, leaving the stop just as she lowered her arm. She turned and hurried to a nearby telephone booth. When my light turned green and I started my car, I wished I were behind the bus to offer her a ride. Her extreme agitation was evident, even at the distance I was from her. My desire instantly materialized into a mental drama, and as I drove away, the fantasy unfolded into the next scene. I opened the car door, and a lady dressed in grey got in, relieved and warmly thanking me. She was out of breath from the run and said, "I just need to go a few blocks. I have to meet some friends, and I was afraid they'd leave without me when I missed my bus." I dropped her off a short distance later, and she was delighted to see her friends still waiting. She thanked me again and left. The complete mental scene unfolded in the time it takes to drive 1 block at a normal speed. The fantasy satisfied my feelings about the real incident, and I immediately forgot about it. 4 blocks later, I was still in the center lane, and I had to stop again at a red light. My attention was then focused on something I now forget, when suddenly someone knocked on the closed window of my car. I looked and saw a charming old lady with grey hair, dressed entirely in grey, smiling. She asked if I could give her a ride for a few blocks because she missed her bus. She was out of breath, as if she had been running, and I was so surprised by her sudden appearance in the middle of a busy street outside my window that for a moment I could only physically react. Without responding, I leaned over and opened the car door. She got in and said, "It's so frustrating to rush so much and then miss the bus. I wouldn't have imposed on you this way, but I have to meet some friends a few blocks away, and if I had to walk now, I'd miss them." 6 blocks later, she exclaimed, "Well, they're still waiting for me." I dropped her off and she thanked me again before leaving. I drove to my destination on autopilot, fully recognizing that I had witnessed a waking dream materialize into physical action. I recognized what was happening as it was happening. As soon as I could, I wrote down every part of the incident, and I found a remarkable consistency between the waking dream and the subsequent reality. Both women were elderly, kind in their manner, dressed entirely in grey, out of breath from running to catch a bus they missed. Both wanted to meet friends who, for some reason, couldn't wait much longer, and both left my car within a few blocks after successfully meeting their friends. I'm amazed, confused, and exultant. If there are no such things as coincidence or accident, then we truly live in a world of magic, where our thoughts and dreams can materialize into reality. So I witnessed how imagination almost instantly transforms into reality. There is a moment in every day that Satan cannot find, nor even his sentinel demons can find it. But the industrious find this moment and multiply it, and once found, it renews every moment of the day if correctly placed. Since the first time I read your research, I have desired to live a vision since you spoke of the promise, and this desire has intensified. I want to tell you about my vision, which was a glorious answer to my prayer, but I am sure I would not have had this experience without something that happened 2 weeks ago. I needed to park my car some distance from the university building where I was supposed to give my lecture. As I got out of my car, I was aware of the quietness around me. The street was completely deserted, no one in sight. Suddenly I heard a cursing voice, very frightening. I looked in the direction of the sound and saw a man waving a stick, shouting vile words. "I'm going to kill you! I'm going to kill you!" I continued on my way as he approached me because at that moment I thought, now I can test what I have professed to believe. If I truly believe that we are one with the Father, this desperate man and I, no harm can come to me. At that moment I was not afraid. Instead of seeing a man approaching me, I felt a light. He stopped shouting, dropped his stick, and walked calmly past me, with less than a foot of distance between us. Having tested my faith at that moment, everything around me seemed more alive than before, the flowers brighter and the trees greener. I felt a sense of peace and unity of life that I had never experienced before. Last Friday I was driving to our country house. Nothing was unusual during the day or night. I worked on a manuscript, and since I wasn't tired, I didn't try to fall asleep until around 2 in the morning. Then I turned off the light and plunged into that floating sensation. Not asleep, but drowsy, as I call it, half awake and half asleep. Often when I'm in this state, beautiful and unknown faces float before me. But this morning the experience was different. Before me there seemed to be the perfect profile of a child's face. Then it turned and smiled at me. It radiated light and seemed to fill my own head with light. It was radiant and excited, and I thought, this must be Christ. But something within me, without sound, said, no, it's you. I feel that I will never be the same again, and one day I may experience the promise. Our dreams will come true the moment we know that imagination creates reality and act accordingly. But imagination demands from us something much deeper and more fundamental than the creation of things, nothing less than the recognition of one's own unity with God. What it does is actually God Himself doing it in and through man, who is all imagination. Chapter 15. The Promise. In all that I have recounted so far, except for GB's child vision, imagination has been consciously exercised. Men and women have created plays in their imagination, works involving the fulfillment of their desires. By then, imagining themselves participating in these works, they created what their imaginary acts implied. This is the wise use of God's law. But no one is justified before God by the law. Many people are interested in imagism as a way of life, but they are not interested in its framework of faith, a faith that leads to the fulfillment of God's promise. I will be a father to him, and he will be my son. This promise of God to bring forth from our bowels a son who will be born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God, does not concern them. They want God's law, not his promise. Yet this miraculous birth has been clearly stated as a requirement for all humanity since the early days of the Christian community. You must be born again from above. John 3. My purpose here is to declare it again, and to do so in a language that, with reference to my own personal mystical experiences, shows the reader that this birth from above is much more than just a part of a dispensable superstructure. It is the sole purpose of God's creation. Specifically, my purpose in recording these 4 mystical experiences is to show what Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, has in mind. Revelation 1:5. I tried to say about this birth from above, how can they preach if they are not sent? Romans 10:15. Many years ago, I was taken in spirit to a divine society, a society of men where God is awake. Although this may seem strange, the gods are actually present. When I entered this society, the first to greet me was the personification of infinite power. His power was unknown to mortals. Then I was introduced to infinite love. He asked me, "What is the greatest thing in the world?" I replied with Paul's words, "And now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." 1 Corinthians 13:13. At that moment, he embraced me, and our bodies merged to form one body. I was united with him, and I loved him as my own soul. The words, love of God, so often just a phrase, now became a reality with immense meaning. Nothing ever imagined by man could compare to this love that man feels through his union with love. The most intimate relationship on earth is like living in separate cells compared to this union. As I was in this state of supreme delight, a voice from outer space cried out, "Down with the blue blood!" At this explosion, I found myself standing before the one who had greeted me first, the one who personified infinite power. He looked me in the eyes, and without using words or mouth, I heard what he said to me. "It is time to act." I was suddenly torn from this divine society and returned to earth. I was tormented by my limits of understanding, but I knew that on that day, the divine society had chosen me as a companion and sent me to preach Christ, God's promise to man. My mystical experiences have led me to take literally the saying that all the world is a stage and to believe that God plays all the roles. The purpose of the play is to transform created man into God, the Creator. God loved man, his creation, and became man with the faith that this act of self-incarnation would transform created man into God, the Creator. The play begins with the crucifixion of God in man as man and ends with the resurrection of man as God. God becomes what we are so that we may become what he is. God becomes man so that man may first become a living being, then a life-giving spirit. With Christ, I am crucified together, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. God took on the form of man and became obedient unto death, even the death on the cross of man, and he was crucified at Golgotha, the skull of man. God himself passes through the door of death, the human skull, and lies in the tomb of man to make man a living being. God's mercy transformed death into sleep, then began the prodigious and unthinkable metamorphosis of man, the transformation of man into God. No man without the aid of God's crucifixion could pass the threshold that gives access to conscious life, but now we have union with God in his crucified being. He lives in us as our wondrous human imagination. Man is all imagination, and God is man, and exists in us, and we in him. Man's eternal body is imagination, meaning God himself. When he rises within us, we will be like him, and he will be like us. Then all impossibilities will dissolve in us in that touch of exaltation which his rising within us will confer upon our nature. Here is the secret of the world. God died to give life to man and to set him free. For even though God is clearly conscious of his creation, it does not follow that imaginatively created man is conscious of God. To accomplish this miracle, God had to die and then rise again as man, and no one expressed it as clearly as William Blake. Blake says, or rather, has Jesus say, "Unless I die, you cannot live. But if I die, I will rise again, and you will rise with me." Would you love someone who has never died for you, or would you die for someone who has never died for you? And if God does not die for man and give himself eternally for man, man could not exist. So God dies, that is, God freely gives himself for man, deliberately becomes man and forgets that he is God, with the hope that man thus created will ultimately rise as God. God offered his own being so much for man that he cries on man's cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. He completely forgot that he is God, but after God rises in a man, this man will tell his brothers, "Why are we here, trembling, calling to God for help, and not to ourselves, in whom God dwells?" Blake. This first man who rose from the dead is known as Jesus Christ, the first fruits of those who are asleep, the firstborn from the dead. By one man, God died. Now also by one man came the resurrection of the dead. Jesus Christ resurrects his dead father by becoming his father in Adam, the universal man. God sleeps in Jesus Christ, individualized God. God awakens. Upon man's awakening, the created has become God the Creator and can truly say before the world was, "I am." Adon Olam, Jewish dogma. Just as God, in his love for man, identified so completely with man that he forgot he was God, so man, in his love for God, must identify so completely with God that he lives the life of God, that is, imaginatively, the game of God that transforms man into God is revealed to us in the Bible. It is entirely consistent in imagery and symbolism. The New Testament is hidden in the Old Testament, and the Old is manifested in the New. The Bible is a vision of God's law and his promise. It was never intended to teach history, but rather to guide man in faith through the torment of affliction towards the fulfillment of God's promise, to awaken him from this deep sleep and to awaken him as God. Its characters do not live in the past, but in an imaginative eternity. They are personifications of the eternal spiritual states of the soul. They mark man's journey through eternal death and his awakening to eternal life. The Old Testament speaks of God's promise. The New Testament does not tell us how this promise was fulfilled, but how it is fulfilled. The central theme of the Bible is the direct, individual and personal mystical experience of the birth of the child, this child of whom the prophet spoke. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Isaiah 9:6-7. When the child is revealed to us, we see him, we experience him, and the response to this revelation can be expressed in the words of Job. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Job 42:5. The story of the Incarnation is not a fable, an allegory, or a carefully crafted fiction to enslave the minds of men, but a real mystical fact. It is a personal mystical experience of self-birth, of one's own skull symbolized by the birth of a child wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying on the ground. There is a difference between hearing about this birth of a child from one's own skull, a birth that no scientist or historian could explain, and actually experiencing the birth by holding it in one's own hands and seeing it with one's own eyes. This miraculous child, a child born from above of your own skull, a birth contrary to all the laws of nature. The question, as it is posed in the Old Testament, now asks and sees if a man can give birth. Why do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman in labor, and all faces turned pale? Jeremiah 30:6. The Hebrew word shalat, mistranslated as loins, means to go out, to release, to withdraw, to come out of oneself from one's own skull. This was exactly what the prophet foresaw as the necessary birth from above, a birth that gives man access to the kingdom of God and thoughtful perception at the highest levels of being. Throughout the ages, one abyss calls to another, Psalms 42:7. Awake, why are you sleeping, Lord? Awake, Psalms 44:23. The event, as recorded in the Gospels, actually occurs within man, but from that day or hour when the individual will be delivered, no one knows except the Father. Do you not know that I told you that it is necessary to be born from above? John 3:7, just as Paul. I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught, but it came through a real mystical experience of being born from above. No one can truly speak of this mystical birth from above, except one who has experienced it. I had no idea that this birth from above was literally true. Who before the experience could have believed that the wonderful child, the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the eternal Father, the Prince of Peace was woven into his own skull? Who before the experience would understand that his Creator is his husband and that the Lord of hosts is his name? Isaiah 54:5. Who would believe that the Creator has entered into his own creation, man, and recognized it as himself, and that this entry into man's skull, this union of God and man, resulted in the birth of a son from man's skull, a birth that gave this man eternal life and union with his Creator forever? If I now relate what I experienced that night, it is not to impose my ideas on others, but to give hope to those who, like Nicodemus, wonder, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? How can this be? John 3:4. Here is how it happened in my case. Therefore, now I will write the vision and clarify it on tablets, so that he who reads it may run, for the vision is still awaiting its time. It hastens toward the end. It will not lie. Though it may seem delayed, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not be delayed. The soul that is not upright within him shall wax feeble, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Habakkuk 2. In the early hours of the morning of July 20th, 1959, in the city of San Francisco, a heavenly dream where the arts flourished was suddenly interrupted by an intense vibration centered at the base of my skull. Then began a drama as real as the experiences I have when I am fully awake. I woke up from a dream to find myself completely buried inside my skull. I tried to come out through the base of my skull. Something gave way, and I felt myself descending through the base of my skull. I pushed myself out inch by inch. When I was almost out, I grabbed what I thought was the foot of the bed and pulled the rest of myself out of my skull. There, on the floor, I lay for a few moments. Then I got up and looked at my body on the bed. It had a pale face lying on its back and tossing from side to side like someone recovering from a great ordeal. As I gazed upon it, hoping it wouldn't fall off the bed, I realized that the vibration that had initiated the whole drama was not only in my head but also seemed to come from the corner of the room. Looking into that corner, I wondered if this vibration might be caused by a very strong wind, strong enough to shake the window. I did not realize that the vibration I still felt in my head was related to the one that seemed to come from the corner of the room. Looking back at the bed, I found that my body had disappeared, but in its place were seated my 3 elder brothers. My eldest brother was where the head had been, my other 2 brothers were where the feet had been. None of them seemed to be aware of me, though I was aware of them and could discern their thoughts. Suddenly I realized the reality of my own invisibility. I noticed that they too were disturbed by the vibration coming from the corner of the room. My 3rd brother was more disturbed and went to investigate the cause of the disturbance. His attention was drawn to something on the floor, and looking down, he announced, "This is Neville's baby." My other 2 brothers, incredulous, asked, "How can Neville have a baby?" My brother lifted the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed it on the bed. Then, with my invisible hands, I lifted the baby and asked, "How is my dear?" He looked me in the eyes and smiled. Then I woke up in this world to reflect on this, the greatest of my many mystical experiences. Tennyson describes death as a warrior, a tall skeleton on a black horse, coming out at midnight. But when Gareth's sword pierced the skull, there was within it the shining face of a blossoming child, fresh as a newborn flower. I will recount the idols of the king and 2 other visions, for they confirm the truth of my statement that the Bible is a mystical fact. All that is written about the promised child in the law of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms, must be experienced mystically in the individual's imagination. The birth of the child is a sign and a portent indicating the resurrection of David, the chosen one of the Lord, of whom he said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Psalms 27:5. 5 months after the birth of the child, on the morning of December 6, 1959 in Los Angeles, a vibration similar to the one that preceded his birth began in my head. This time, its intensity was concentrated at the top of my head. Then a sudden explosion occurred, and I found myself in a modestly furnished room. There, leaning against the side of an open door, stood my son David, famous in the Bible. He was a young man in his early teens. What struck me remarkably was the unusual beauty of his face and figure, as described in the first book of Samuel, fair with beautiful eyes and very handsome. At no time did I feel any different from what I am now, yet I knew that this young David was my son, and he knew that I was his father, because the wisdom that comes from above has no uncertainty. But the wisdom that comes from above is first of all pure, then peaceful, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, without uncertainty or hypocrisy. James 3:17. As I sat contemplating the beauty of my son, the vision faded, and I woke up. I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. Isaiah 8:18. God gave me David as my own son. I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. 2 Samuel 7:12-14. God is known only through the Son. No one knows who the Son is except the Father, or who the Father is except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Matthew 11:27. When David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." 1 Samuel 17:55-58. Jesse is another form of the verb to be. In other words, I am the son of him whom I am. I begot myself. I am the son of God the Father. I and my Father, we are one. John 10:3. I am the image of the invisible God. Whoever sees me sees the Father. John 14:9. Whose son is he? It is not about David, but about David's father, to whom the king had promised to deliver Israel. 1 Samuel 17:25. I have found David my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him. Psalms 89:20. He shall cry to me, "You are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation." Psalms 89:26. Now I know that I am one of the Elohim, the God who became man so that man may become God. 1 Timothy 3:16. If the Bible were history, it would not be a mystery. Wait for the promise of the Father, that is, wait for David, the Son of God, who will reveal you as the Father. Acts 1:4. You have learned these things from me. Luke 24:44. They will be fulfilled in their time. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Galatians 4:4-5.